Hello, hello. Okay. Alrighty. Hello, hello. Yeah, I knocked my microphone USB port out, and we're back. We're back though. Hello, welcome to you all. Thank you for tuning in to another Fly the Neutrophil stream. Today oh goodness, already off to a great start. We are raising money for LA Wildfire Relief. This is a charity event that our very own vtheorem member Syzygy, or Z, had organized very, very quickly because, of course, tragedy does not wait for any of us to have our stuff together. And so today we will actually be starting off this series of streams. I am honored to be the first one to pilot this Tiltify collaboration, where we will hopefully be able to track how many donations come from each individual audience. But it looks like, in terms of the donations, we do have already a donation, a very generous $50 donation from Bobo. And apparently I will have to match immediately, and I'll put on the cat outfit. Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay, first, before we get started, I'll just say hi to you all. Hello, Celeste. Hello, Cold Life. Again, thank you for tuning in, even though it is very late where you are. Thank you for dropping in, Cold Life, another one of us streamers who are collaborating together to raise money for Wildfire Relief. Hello, Dreamless Sleep. Welcome, welcome. Hello, Moon. And hello, Marlin. Welcome, welcome. Silly Cat Boy. Hello, good to see you. Nitro. Xenotime. Hi from another participant in the charity event. Thank you so much for tuning in to me today. Hello, Archie. Welcome. Hello, A and Bobo, of course. Myelin, welcome, welcome. Another vtheorem member, also streaming later today. Astral, welcome, welcome. Pembu, hello, another one of us. Pembu, I'm especially excited to see your stream, although I'm probably going to have to watch the VOD in all honesty, because Pembu has so graciously, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but in our kind of our planning Discord chat, Pembu, I think one of your ideas was to play Tetris, and every time you would lose, you would have to donate, which I am personally very, very, very excited for. So because that's a hilarious idea. Okay, with that being said, let's get into business, shall we? And that is correct. That's awesome. Yes, I'm very, very much looking forward to watching the VOD. Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend live, though. So on the screen, you have here a little bit of background of what this event is and how this event is functioning. So, around when the wildfire started, Z had this idea to do a sort of charity stream, but at the time, she didn't really know how to do it, and she had known that I was planning my own glioblastoma stream. And so, we were chatting in vtheorem chat about what could be done. And the thing is that this project started very humbly, and again, not very long ago, just a week ago. In fact, in this first iteration, Z had the idea of not even having milestone rewards, not even keeping a number or a goal to reach for, being very humble, being a little worried about the fact that we're all, small VTubers. But from there, the ambition and the coordination skyrocketed, and she, again, at the drop of a dime, had made the call and had a whole bunch of VTubers agree to help out. This is something that I've been saying a lot in my glioblastoma stream, the charity stream that I had held last week. Individually, we might be very small individual cells, but we come together, we can be like an organ or a tissue or something, right? So I think it is a very smart way to circumvent the limitations of being a small VTuber, while at the same time having a lot of fun and promoting interconnectedness among streamers, which I am personally very thankful for. You can see that all of vtheorem is participating in one way or another. I believe Nep is missing from this schedule, but she will be streaming tomorrow about the role of horticulture in wildfire development. And so, for me, there's not a way that I could have a wildfire theme to my stream. So instead, I pulled an idea that I'd been sitting on just in case I needed to make content at a drop of a dime. And so here we are. Today, we are going to be talking about Darwin. But before that, I just want to point out how crazy some of these how some of these milestones are for Z. If we raise $6,000 $6,283 in total combined between, the dozen of us. Z will be launched into space, and given the fact that she has had a work history with the Jet Propulsion Lab by NASA, I am inclined to believe that this is a real possibility. Thank you so much for the donation, Joe. Welcome. And thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, Neutrophil benchmark got hit within 2 seconds. Exactly. Like, I don't know. This cat outfit really does something for people. It's amazing. All right. So yeah, very exciting milestones for Z. Unfortunately, my brain is too fried from my last charity stream to have my own personal milestone stuff except for the cat outfit, but I will be matching $50, and we've already hit that kind of benchmark. We're already making great progress for Z's initial goal, which is very exciting. Are there any links to all the people on if you type exclamation mark vtheorem, you'll be redirected to vtheorem at the very least. I also have vtheorem links in my chat, just in my video description down below. However, you can quickly screen grab the links that are on screen right now. Bad on me for not having an easy link to redirect to everybody's individual link, but the picture is up, and I can also post this particular image as a community post, which will be available after the stream. Yeah, thank you so much for reminding me, though. I should definitely do that after the stream ends. Thank you so much. All right. So let's get started, shall we? Let's talk about some Darwin. I'm very excited to talk about this because this video is actually my 100th video upload. Let me move the layer a little bit. My 100th video upload to YouTube, which is huge. I have been making content for a little over a year now, and this is a combination, of course, of all the shorts and all the live videos and all the long form videos that I've done. My total video count that is public is a little less than 100, but that's because I've privated some videos for copyright reasons. But this is, pretty meaningful to me as someone who has had so many creative ventures just burn up in flames. The fact that I've gotten one creative hobby to last as long as 100 videos is actually pretty huge. Thank you so much for the congratulations. Sadly, I got no money, though we should do gaming stream and then Barrow Trauma. It's going to be fun, I promise, especially if he plays on a public server. Yeah, everybody is totally free to contribute however they wish. We're all given a certain number of tools at our disposal, and whatever we can do with those tools to help is greatly appreciated. Yeah, 100th vid. It's really fantastic. I'm very hyped to see that I have seen this creative hobby through. Because today we'll actually be touching upon the fact that I have been failing at creative hobbies since I was very young, probably in the just chatting section, but yeah. Okay, enough of celebrating me. Let's go ahead and celebrate some other things, like where we are today. So back when I had maybe a dozen video uploads, I had the idea to stream about Darwin because I actually really love the work of Darwin, and I also find him to be essentially like a scientific hero of mine, if you could call him that. Even though we do very different biology, right? Like Darwin was a naturalist and I am a molecular biologist, and between our bodies of work there's like 100-200 years of development since then. But in terms of Darwin's flair, his style, I really think that I value the way that he communicated in some ways much more than I even respect science communicators today. Not that science communicators today don't do a great job, it's just that Darwin's contribution to the development of biology is so instrumental that had he not been perfect in his writing, it could have set back modern biology by at least 100 years. It's crazy, absolutely crazy. Why the cat outfit? We hit our $50 milestone for this stream, and I figured I'd put on the outfit. Yeah. Okay. What I mean when I say I like biology versus what you think when I say I like biology, I'm not entirely sure what that means entirely. But what I can say is I really, really do enjoy biology. But the first time that I tried to talk about Darwin, this was back when I was still in the single digit hell, which, you know, every small indie streamer goes through this. It's a very normal process. Some stay in this hell longer than others. But the first time I talked about Darwin, I literally streamed to almost nobody, right? You can see by my data here that for a stretch of maybe 5 minutes I had one viewer, and then I was just talking to myself, which was depressing. So it is very exciting for me to now have enough people in the audience to fill up a classroom so that I can nerd out about Darwin professionally. Yes, fellow molecular bioscientists, let's go. Yes, Bobo, yes. Bio together strong. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin. So the origin of species needs no introduction, of course, but just to, get things on the same page, the origin of species laid the foundation of modern biology as we know it. Biology didn't really exist back in Darwin's time about 200 years ago, right? Biologists of the era were known as actual naturalists, right? Kind of like the ancestors of botanists, zoologists, and paleontologists. They all just kind of got lumped together as scientists who study the natural world. So the origin of species, OAS, so it should be OS. The origin of species was published as a public abstract to a much more intense piece of work that would be written specifically for scientists. So actually, the origin of species is meant for casual people to read in the same way that Shakespeare is meant for the casual person to read, in the same way that these works of writing are very difficult to read by modern day standards, but they were originally written for the common people of the day. So that's important to keep in mind. This book was published in a rush because Darwin was about to be scooped by another naturalist called Alfred Wallace. And so I think that is why the origin of species is so long, because Darwin was just yapping. He was just yapping the entire time in the book because he needed to get this out before he completely got scooped by Wallace, who, by the way, had a very similar idea to Darwin with regards to natural selection, although if Darwin was like 90% right in terms of the shots that he called, I think Alfred Wallace was like 80% right. So Darwin had better ideas, but not by much. And so the threat of Wallace kind of scooping his glory was very salient to him. Although it's heartening to know that these two did not have like an antagonistic relationship. They were actually friends. And so Wallace was like, hey, I'm getting pretty close. And then when Darwin got rushed to publish this, Alfred didn't hold any negative feelings towards him. So that can often not be the case when it comes to scientists, because scientists are people and people can be very petty and vindictive, of course. Today's a great day. We get to see Fi's persona once more. You can thank Bobo as well as the other anonymous donations before him. And of course, I don't know that I thought. Did I thank Syzygy? I did thank Syzygy. Yes, you can thank all the donations that have come in to raise money for the LA wildfires. So were they competing? Or yeah, in the same way that like every scientist in the same field is competing. It's just that like when you get a sense for when a scientist is ready to share their findings, that's when things get serious, right? Because my organic chemistry professor used to have this logo, his motto. He would say this every class: there's no second place in science. So you actively want to be the first to make your discovery, because that is where the recognition, the fame, the glory of doing science comes from. So they were competing, but it wasn't a toxic competition, right? They weren't sabotaging each other. They were pretty cordial with one another. It's just that because Wallace was getting closer, Darwin needed to hurry up, because Darwin sank years into this book. It's not like, oh, Darwin would have... You can understand that if you spent like half a decade of your life writing this book and some other guy's about to scoop you, it would be reasonable that you would change your attitude towards publishing in order to get there first. Okay. Revisiting the origin of species was interesting. So I am a word nerd. I think that is fair to say. I have been very interested in the rhetorical arts, we'll call it, since I was an undergrad. I've always been an appreciator of how words craft ideas and how people communicate. And I first read The Origin of Species Well, first I read it in high school because my AP biology teacher made us read several excerpts of it, and as a high schooler, it was almost impossible to understand. As an undergraduate in my science of rhetoric class, it was a lot better, but it was still quite hard. And I had a lot more energy to tackle hard problems back then, as you can see here in progenitor phi. But, current phi, neutrophil phi, even though I am, as some people describe, a hag at this point, I don't have as much of that mental energy to tackle hard problems, but I'm much more cognitively aware, metacognitively aware of myself in terms of I know how I learn and now I know how I don't learn, and that helps. And then I also have a lot more background knowledge, so I've just been a biologist for a longer number of years. And so these two things combined, I believe you can classify them as force multipliers. So what I mean to say is that when I sat down to read The Origin of Species in my first attempt as an undergraduate, as a baby, essentially, it was really hard, and I skipped a lot of it because it's tough. It's like reading Shakespeare, but for science. Now that I'm hag age, I'm seeing insights that I never saw before, because while people love saying that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species to be read by anybody, the practical reality is it's not an easy read. It's still not an easy read. All right. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my original undergraduate thesis, and the reason why I want to talk a little bit about this is just to give you an idea of how many interesting rhetorical pieces of knowledge you can pull out of The Origin of Species. And this is just one of them. This is the thing that I chose to focus on in undergrad as someone who took a lot of rhetoric classes, and I still think that this thesis that I wrote holds up today. So here is what I have determined from reading The Origin of Species. The unstated but logical conclusion of On the Origin of Species is that life arose from one or a couple of different ancestors. So Darwin is never explicit in his endorsement of a singular origin of life, nor is he anti-religion. This can be kind of confusing for people because, any neckbeard atheist of the modern day often cites evolution in terms of a bludgeon to use on the skulls of people who believe in supernatural origins of, living beings. But the thing is that Darwin had to tackle a world that was highly sympathetic to the idea that life had a supernatural origin. So you don't actually do the new atheist neckbeard thing and bludgeon people over the head with your big brain facts, but what you do is you come down to people, you meet them at their level, because if you are spouting ideas that are so fundamentally opposed to their view of how the world works, just because you happen to be right doesn't necessarily mean that they will believe you. So Darwin wrote very artistically, very carefully around the subject of God, and that is what I chose to focus on in my thesis. I mean, Darwin did give co-authorship to Wallace, but Wallace seemed to spend much of the rest of his life getting into fights with flat earthers. Oh, I didn't know that. I just know that Darwin and Wallace were like bros, even though they were actually rivals. Did your frontal lobe finish developing? I actually think that the meme of you stop maturing at the age of 25 is not useful, because I feel way smarter than I was back when I was 25. At 25, I had the maximum amount of cognitive energy to throw at problems, but now my brain is more efficient. It takes fewer action potentials, fewer synapses for me to understand harder problems. I'm just tired sooner. So overall, I know it's a bit of a meme and whatever, but I think it's important for all of you young people out there, the second you turn 25, you don't get dumber, right away. Right. You actually, whatever neuroscientists want to say about the age of the brain, and I think it's also a myth that the brain stops maturing at 25. But even if it were not a myth, what is true is that you can get more efficient over time, even if, quote unquote, you don't have as much energy. We'll try to catch up on the VOD. This is extremely interesting. Good night. Thank you for tuning in, and good night. And please go check out Code Live stream later on in this series. Yeah. Man, I hope I'm not like this forever. You will. The thing is that the more you learn and the more you are aware of your own learning, the smarter you will get. Although I don't know how old you are right now. Thankfully, I peaked in middle school, so I don't have to worry about that. Nah, don't say that about yourself. Come on. in Abrahamic religions, only human creation was actually described. That's also interesting. And since Darwin is living in a period of time where Abrahamic religions would be the most relevant to his social circle, that is important to recognize as well. All right. That just comes with age, lose energy, but gain depth and wisdom. Exactly. A depth and wisdom makes you more efficient, so you don't have to work quite as hard for the same things. Okay. So, my thesis that I wrote as an undergraduate was focused on Darwin leveraged this rhetorical tool called polysemy. So poly meaning many and semi meaning meaning. This is a strategy that rhetoricians or writers use to imbue multiple layers of meaning onto the same text. And so Abraham Lincoln was a very famous example of this. In his Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote words that could be interpreted differently by the North and the South, and in an attempt to unite them on all fronts. And Darwin does the same in The Origin of Species, using words that can be interpreted by people who are sympathetic to a supernatural origin and people who are sympathetic to a naturalist origin, we could say. He also made direct appeals to the creator. This is evident in the fact that Darwin published multiple different editions of The Origin of Species, and in later editions, he actually added references to God, probably because he wanted to sort of soften the blow of what people might think about his book. And 3, evocation of natural beauty to soften this message for those who might find this message hard to swallow. Again, new atheists, neckbeards, you take your bludgeon of your big brain and science facts and you bash religious people over the head, and they are not going to, you're not helping. You know, you're not helping with education, you're not doing any of that. The thing about people is people learn best through stories, not through logic. We aren't computing machines, really. We are funny walking apes. And funny walking social apes learn better through stories than they do through logic. So that's something important to recognize. And Darwin, for the time, you know, people today don't even understand that concept, but Darwin 200 years before had a pretty firm grasp at what gets what gets people's hearts moving, I should say. Okay, so let's read this excerpt. It's a little small. Maybe I'll blow it up a bit. Give me 1 second, and I will try to change this text size now that I'm seeing what that looks like. Oh, that screws up all my underlining. You know what? I'll just read this out loud. Because it's a beautiful passage. Darwin, again, wrote beautifully, so I'll just read this out loud. It is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the eye to a telescope. Thank you so much for the donation, Pamela. Thank you so much. That's awesome. So I'll actually match that. So that is a $20 donation directly to me, but now I will donate that additional $20 towards the Wildlife Fund. Thank you so much, Pamela. It is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the eye to a telescope. Anybody who's spent any number of minutes in atheism circles or evolution debate circles know that this is a very, very common argument. This is so common that it's not a surprise, right? There's a fundamental incongruence for people who don't like to believe in evolution, that something as structurally complex as the eye could never have been achieved through slight modifications, right? This is an age-old, literally age-old debate, and Darwin is addressing it, 200 years ago. We know that this instrument has been perfected by the long continued efforts of the highest human intellects, and we naturally infer that the eye has been formed by a somewhat analogous process. But may not this interference be presumptuous? Have we any right to assume that the creator works by intellectual powers like those of man? If we must compare the eye to an optical instrument, we must ought in imagination to take a thick layer of transparent tissue with a nerve sensitive to light, and then suppose every part of this layer to be continually changing slowly in density so as to separate into layers of different densities and thickness placed at different distances from one another, and with the surfaces of each layer slowly changing in form. Further, we must suppose that there is a power always intently watching each slight accidental alteration in the transparent layers, and carefully selecting each alteration which under varied circumstances may in any way or in any degree tend to produce a distincter image. We must suppose each new state of the instrument to be multiplied by the million, and each to be preserved till a better be produced, and then the old copies to be destroyed. In living bodies, variations will cause the slight alterations, generation will multiply them almost infinitely, and natural selection will pick out the unerring scale of each improvement. Let this process go on for millions and on millions of years, and during each year on millions of individuals on many kinds, and may we not believe that a living optical instrument might thus be formed as superior to one of a glass, as the works of the Creator are to those of man. And that is a beautiful, beautiful paragraph. And so in my thesis, I did stuff like underline passages and, I said work harder, smarter, not harder, because the rest of this is very hard to read. But if you just Control F Creator or God, you can actually find all the passages that Darwin addresses religiosity in this text. Okay, so here we're talking about the irreducible complexity of the I, common anti-evolution sentiment. So that is how Darwin, that is what Darwin is predicting as a counter-argument to his thesis. Here, but may not this inference be presumptuous? Have we any right to assume that the Creator works by intellectual powers like those of man? This is actually a completely genius mind trick, right? So there's this idea that God, everything in the world is so beautifully designed. God must have designed it. God must have sat down with a pen and paper, tried a bunch of things, and just printed those designs, right? That's sort of the process by which creationists would like to see the world. And so Darwin here is saying that's kind of lame, actually, because that's what humans do, and God is way better, way smarter than humans are, right? A human sits down with a graph paper and draws things out and fails a bunch of times. That's not very exciting at all. So surely God works in more mysterious ways than conscious design. So how does God work instead? Here, this last sentence, this is an appeal to beauty. This is an alternate story that appeals to the same part of people's hearts that wants to believe that God is designing each individual living life form. So here we see, in living bodies, variation will cause the slight alterations. Generation will multiply them almost infinitely, evoking the concept of infinity is analogous to invoking the concept of God, right? This all-knowing, all-powerful being that lives forever. Infinity is a way to evoke the feeling of religiosity, even though we're not ascribing this to literal design. So you can have this idea of God did everything, but you don't have to also say that God designed it, right? This is what Catholics believe. Catholics are not in conflict with the idea of natural selection and evolution. You just have to say God did everything. And natural selection will pick out with unerring skill each improvement. So this is really giving props to God, right? With unerring skill each improvement. So this idea that nature itself, that God acting through nature is picking out certain aspects, certain traits of biological organisms to perfect species. Instead of designing them, God is refining them over infinite timescales because God is infinitely powerful and infinitely all-knowing. Let this process go on for millions on millions of years, and during each year on millions of individuals of many kinds, and may we not believe that a living optical instrument might thus be formed as superior to one of glass, as the works of the Creator are to those of man. Basically saying, we as humans built the microscope or the telescope, God built our eye. And God had to do that in a way that is a lot smarter than man because man is stupid compared to God, right? And I want to just sit in this for a hot second just to be like, this paragraph is amazing with regards to bridging the gap between people who have a religious or a intelligent design perspective versus someone who believes in a more naturalist origin of species, right? And this isn't condescending. This is making an appeal, an emotional appeal even, to the same sentiments. And this you could point to as being one of the paragraphs that allowed Darwin to publish this and for it to not be thrown out into the trash, right? You have to remember that this is a very hostile idea at the end of the day to the idea of supernatural origins. But if you package it correctly, if you give people a story that they are excited to believe in, you can go a lot further. I remember in 7th grade, I had a debate with my youth leader being, what if God just planned evolution? Didn't go very well, instantly shut down. So debate is not the way to do this. Instead, it is coming together and sharing one vision that you can interpret in different ways. Polysemy, right? The verbal, rhetorical technique of bridging the gap. And I love this paragraph so much. It is so striking to me how beautiful Darwin was capable of writing. It's just gorgeous. Yeah, so give people something to believe in. Appeal to the same. So underneath that belief in God is a deeper emotional attachment to the idea, right? And so if you give people something to believe in, a new story that appeals to the same part of their heart, not their brain, but their heart, that can move minds a lot easier. So, don't be a neckbeard atheist. That's not the way to do it. It's an effective example of science communication, but I guess you have to be perceived as like them in order to be accepted in this way. Yeah, people's mind, people were just dumb apes, right? We can perceive ideas as threatening if they come from someone that we perceive as to be in an out group. And if you want to hear much more about out group and in group and psychology and conspiracy theory, please go check out 2 of my vtheorem cohort, Myelin and Psydere. 2 psychologists who specifically work on the idea of in-groups and out-groups, and they've been very enlightening to me when thinking about this subject. The giraffe laryngeal nerve is a divine joke. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, there's this idea that, there's a nerve that goes, that loops around the giraffe's entire neck, when in reality, if someone were to intelligently design the giraffe, that nerve would be going from point A to point B instead of making a whole loop around the giraffe's whole neck. That's something that you can point to. But again, it doesn't really bridge the gap of people who are believing in a supernatural origin of God, of the species, because it is comforting. That's not addressing that part, because say you throw that fact to them, you bash them on the head, on the cranium with that fact. Say they even believe it. There's going to be a gap in their heart where they are no longer feeling the security of the thing that they need to believe in to live a normal, happy life. So while atheists and agnostics or people who just believe in natural selection and evolution, we can all meme about, giraffe nerves, but in reality, we're just in a circle, perhaps doing the thing where you are, say, for example, appealing to each other's intellect in a circle. That's what I'll say. And welcome, Syzygy, the organizer of this fund. We are already off to the races, Z, on accomplishing our goals here with some very generous donations. Thank you so much for dropping in, Z. I wish rhetoric was taught in all schools. You can find some rhetorical degrees in undergraduate, right? In high school, it's a little early to be reading so carefully, because a lot of the foundational texts that you need to read for an understanding of rhetoric are pretty hard. Shakespeare's hard enough, but reading old Greek texts like Plato and Aristotle, it's a headache. So I think when you get to undergraduate, you can find a lot more rhetorical classes or rhetoric classes. All right. I can't believe after half an hour we've raised so much. So thankful for this incredible start. I am very honored to be the starting gun, right? I get to be here at the very beginning, which is very exciting. I love being at the forefront of preliminary data, so that's very, very cool. All right. We're not here to pick apart religious themes in The Origin of Species, but to read it fresh, right? The text Origin of Species is not actually very perfect, right? Darwin got a lot right in the book, but there are some parts of the book that are kind of sus. And so, while my undergraduate thesis could be the topic of a different stream, I just wanted to do The Origin of Species, reading it as, my current hag age as being a professional biologist for a certain number of years, just to give you my interpretation. And to make it really honest, I didn't look up someone else's interpretation. This is my own eyes. So whatever mistakes that I make in interpreting Darwin's book they're my own, basically, right? So I'm owning my misinterpretations if I do have any. So that's important. Why is the scientific world so afraid of Darwin's principles breaching the containment of biology? I don't really know what you mean by that. Okay. So, origin of species is not necessarily up to date with how we think of evolution today. In fact, Darwin gets really bogged down in a certain element of evolution that I find really fascinating, which I'll talk a little bit about in a future slide. Even I have a unique perspective being a molecular biologist as opposed to an ecologist, right? So, I am someone who thinks a lot about molecules and genes and viruses, and for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that evolution means a certain thing in the context of viruses and bacteria and stuff like that. When I talk about evolution, I'm typically not talking about competition between species, right? Like, unless you're talking about a microbiome paper where certain strains of E. coli are trying to compete with other strains of E. coli, I actually ignore competition as a concept almost entirely. In fact, it's more realistic to say that in my application of evolution and in my personal practice of molecular biology, I view evolution a lot more as fitness coming from an environment, and competitors are just things in that environment, we'll say. So Darwin is really obsessed with this idea of competition, which for me, through my lens, is maybe he focuses too much on it for my taste, but I think for the time it made sense because, well, molecular biologists weren't a thing back there, right? Darwin is infiltrating economics. Actually, economics infiltrated him. Darwin took very heavy lessons from Malthusian economics, and that is a big part of the origin of species here. All right. Oh, welcome, Akazu Hadrian. Good to see you. Let's see. Okay, so it's fascinating to deconstruct Darwin's opus and analyze the arguments to see how it works, right? Like, I hope I convinced you through that religion argument that Darwin is a master of science communication. And it is like watching Picasso paint or Michelangelo paint. You know, it feels like that as a biologist. Wait, what do economics have to do with Darwin? I'll get into it. Real quick. I'll get into it. Okay. But isn't fitness just structural stability? So it's not biology. It would be all sorts of systems. I mean, this is all how you choose to define certain terminologies, and I won't really get too much into that. But just know that competition doesn't really matter for me in my particular practice of molecular biology. Okay. So, what came before Darwin? Oh, and thank you, Stephen, for pointing out that if you take certain aspects of Darwinism to the extreme, you end up interfering with some concepts that are just very fundamental for our experiences as human beings. Okay. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Like, I am not here to talk about the sort of way that people take Darwin's arguments and use them in ways that are not very good, in my opinion. So we'll just cut that conversation there, and if I see it going on in chat, I will stop it myself. So please keep the chat away from topics that are, let's say, not very scientific. Okay. Okay. So the great chain of being. Okay. So God created taxa, and they are not organically related, no matter how similar they are. And so this is an interesting concept, I would say, right? Actually, let me just real quick. So this is an interesting concept because this is a very like straightforward interpretation of how things work. Let me just do that real quick. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, sorry, scrambled brain. So God created taxa, and they're not organically related, no matter how similar they are, right? So even though, as scientists, we can say there are birds, and within the category of birds, there are woodpeckers, pigeons, falcons, hawks, turkeys, eagles, chickens, finches, no matter how similar these birds are in the great chain of being model, where God is on top, angels are lower than God, and then lower than God are angels are humans, and then all the animals and plants and everything. Even though these birds are very similar, they are not related, and this is how people thought about the taxonomy of animals, even back in Linnaeus's time, right? So the father of modern biology taxonomy, Linnaeus had this two name phylogenetic system where you have a genus name and a species name. And even back during then, this idea of the great chain of being was still around, right? So the reason why I say that is because in order to fully appreciate the brilliance of Darwin's work, you have to understand the context by which Darwin exists in. So for all the very pretentious biologists who say every biologist needs to read The Origin of Species, it is the foundational element of your work. And okay, I kind of see what you mean there. I don't think you have to read Origin of Species to be a good biologist. In fact, I wager that most biologists probably have not read The Origin of Species, again, because it's just kind of hard to read. But it's not even that, like, reading The Origin of Species is good for you. It's like you not only have to read The Origin of Species, but then you have to read every Wikipedia page about the context before you can appreciate The Origin of Species. So let me do that work for you and summarize a bit of the context here. Okay, so the stuff that really enabled Darwin's ideas to pop off were the ideas that were coming out of the field, the very young field of paleontology, right? So people were digging up fossils and that was very hot. And of course, England being very good at digging for things, people were accumulating large collections of fossils. And so the fossil records were being accumulated, and fossils, because there's a growing set of fossils to compare, these fossils are being compared over time, right? So you see that there are fossils of animals that no longer exist, right? You see bones of an animal and a certain skull shape, and you go, hey, that's not really corresponding to any animal that I know of. And so that really got people thinking, and it sort of set up Darwin's ideas for the future, right? So the fossil record and the work of paleontologists cannot be understated with regards to contributing to how Darwin thought about the progression of species. So Darwin's voyage on the SS Beagle opened his eyes to species variability and their relatedness, right? So Darwin took a very famous trip on a boat. Darwin was actually a little bit of a rich F-boy. Like, his parents were doctors. His grandfather was a naturalist, a very famous naturalist with very good work. And so he had all this money, all this privilege to travel the world. And so one of the things that he did, so sort of like how I meme on like rich frat boys, you know, taking a semester off in Europe, that's kind of what he did with the SS Beagle. You know, his father had connections and got him on this exploratory journey over the world. Real paleo geezer. Was the SS Beagle the trip to the Galapagos? I think that he took a couple trips. I don't remember if the Beagle was the one that he took to the Galapagos, because he made a couple of different trips. I'm not entirely sure. At some point I did know, because that first Darwin stream had a lot more biographical research I did into Darwin, and I'm only talking about Origin of Species today. Okay, so Malthusian economics, I think Chad had asked the question, how do economics fit into evolutionary theory? So Darwin was influenced by this idea of scarcity. So Malthusian economics is this, so I'm not an economist, so if I butcher this, I'm sorry, but it's this idea that there are demand and supply based on scarcity, right? So imagine there's a group of birds and they're competing over the same seeds, and so some of those birds will succeed overall and some of those birds will fail, and so that idea of competition, success, and failure comes into play to help Darwin finish this book. And so this is the point in, you know, where I'm like, I don't think you have to have competition to have a basis for evolution, right? It's useful in the sense where, like, this is a useful tool that people can kind of play with in their brain to understand. But I think natural selection works quite well as an origin of species explanation without this idea of competition, because you get all sorts of annoying people who think, everything is in competition, the world is in competition, and we have to be better or we'll die. And that's not, that is taking a very simple idea and coming to a very simple conclusion that does not reflect the complexity of the world. So there is competition, right? And this is something that, maybe I'll indulge myself a little bit here. You know, there's this talk about like alpha males and stuff, and you gotta be the most alpha male and outcompete the other soy boys or whatever. The thing is that mate selection is something that these people love to harp on in terms of being the best competitor, being the alpha, when in reality, mate selection, especially in humans, is quite complex. So you can say that maybe for a certain proportion of the population, the mating strategy of being an alpha male works. And if that were true, we would have a lot more, I think, like if alphaness was selected for across evolutionary time, we would have a society full of alphas, but we don't, right? We have people who are all over the spectrum of we'll call it the expression of cultural masculinity, and so it's obvious, even if you believe in the whole alpha thing, it is at least obvious to see that that is not a trait that is selected for over the course of human history, right? So, I mean, the idea of competition can help explain the idea of evolution and natural selection, but it is, I think, a chapter in the overall story of natural selection versus something that drives natural selection in its entirety, right? Because, two populations of fish, if they get geographically separated by, say, shifting tectonic plates, one fish will experience one kind of environment, the other fish will experience a different kind of environment, and that is sufficient to explain why they might diverge over geologic time. All right. I never would I have imagined I would see Cat Phi talking about alpha males. Hey, it's something that can happen. Anything could happen on this channel. Biology has tendrils in all sorts of different aspects of culture. And often the females do the selecting. Exactly. Right? Like, I'm not going to go into mate selection as a concept because that whole thing is A, not my expertise, B, ripe for people to use as bludgeons to fight other people, and that's not what this channel is really about. Okay, so Darwin had no idea that Mendel existed, and so therefore had no concept of genes, and this is what makes Origin of Species so difficult to read, because you have to remember that Darwin didn't know that there was little codes of biologic molecules within every cell that get passed on, right? Like, you have to kind of unlearn everything you know about biology to fully appreciate Origin of Species. Okay. All right. So what are we going to cover in this series? Originally, I was going to cover these chapters all in one go, but then I figured that this was going to take too long, and therefore I'm only going to cover chapter 1 here, right? Okay, so I think it's important that we actually read the entire introduction just to get a sense for Darwin as a storyteller. And then I'm going to highlight some of these. Multiple Darwin streams? I think so. I think they would be fun and very easy for me to do in case the semester gets too hard and I don't have time to do a journal club, because, I don't have to open up 1,000 different documents. I'm just reading as I go along. Okay, so let's read this together. I'll read it out loud in case you're just listening along. When on board HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of inhabitants of South America and the geological relations of the present to past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species. Light, again, evocation of God, you could say. That mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out on this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. Oh, and Darwin was patient. He waited so long to finish this abstract to the whole book that he would then publish much later. After 5 years of work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes that I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions, which then seemed to me probable from that period to the present day. I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on those personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. So he's hedging here. He's like, I have been working on this for a while, but I am kind of rushing it. You're not going to get all of the data. This is not a book with data in it. It is a book with arguments. So it's important to keep that in context. My work is now nearly finished, but as it will take me 2 or 3 more years to complete it, as my health is far from strong, Darwin was famously very sickly throughout his entire life, I have been urged to publish this abstract. I have more especially been induced to do this as Mr. Wallace, again the guy who is about to scoop him, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusions that I have on the origin of species. I'm about to get scooped. Last year he sent to me a memoir on this subject with a request that I would forward to Sir Charles Lyell, who sent it to me to the Linnean Society, and it is published in the 3rd volume of the Journal of that Society. Sir C. Lyell and Dr. Hooker, who both know of my work, the latter having read my sketch of 1844, honored me by thinking it advisable to publish with Mr. Wallace's excellent memoir some brief extracts from my manuscripts. This abstract, which I now publish, must necessarily be imperfect. I cannot here give references and authorities for my several statements, and I must trust to the reader reposing some confidence in my accuracy. No doubt errors will have crept in, though I hope I have always been cautious in trusting to good authorities alone. I can here give only the general conclusion at which I have arrived, with a few facts in illustration, but which, I hope, in most cases will suffice. No one can feel more sensible than I do of the necessity of hereafter publishing in detail all the facts, with references on which my conclusions have been grounded, and I hope in a future work to do this. For I am well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained by only fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question, and cannot possibly be here done. Okay, so that's a lot of words, but I've done the justice of highlighting some important parts. So here, my work is nearly finished. So am I. I'm slowly dying and getting older. Darwin, very, very sick all the time. It is actually very sad and very tragic. And I'm not going over his notes, his letters today, but he complains about being sick all the time, and it's heartbreaking. The way that he vents is like, God, I hate the world today. I woke up and I hated everything. Very relatable expressions of just feeling miserable all the time, and I do feel bad for him. It must not have been very pleasant having so much work to do and yet being sick all the time. I have more especially been induced to do so as Mr. Wallace, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusions as I have on the origin of species. I'm about to get scooped by Wallace here. I'm about to get scooped by Al, so I need to do this right now. And so that combined, he's kind of hedging that this is not going to be perfect, but, you know, listen to what I have to say, let me cook, and make your judgment afterwards, right? So, chapter 1, this is variation under domestication. I think chapter 1 of the book is, for me, I'm not done reading, like rereading the book, but for me so far, this is the best chapter. This is a chapter I think that is so brilliant in its setup that it feels like, again, watching Michelangelo paint or something, and so I'll walk you through why that is. This is the opening paragraph. When we look to individuals of the same variety or subvariety of our older cultivated plants and animals, one of the first points which strikes us is that they generally differ much more from each other than do individuals of any one species or variety in a state of nature. When we reflect on the vast diversity of the plants and animals which have been cultivated and which have varied during all stages, and have varied during all ages under the most different climates and treatments, I think we are driven to conclude that this greater variability is simply due to our domestic productions having been raised under conditions of life not so uniform as and somewhat different from those to which the parent species have been exposed under nature. There is also, I think, some probability in the view propounded by Andrew Knight that this variability may be partly connected with the excess of food. It seems pretty clear that organic beings must be exposed during several generations to the new conditions of life to cause any appreciable amount of variation, and that when the organization has once begun to vary, it generally continues to vary for many generations. No cases on record of a variable being ceasing to be variable under cultivation. Our oldest cultivated plants, such as wheat, still often yield new varieties. Our oldest domesticated animals are still capable of rapid improvement of modification. So, Darwin chooses to talk about mankind's history of domesticating species. And this is, I think, without a doubt, the best way he could have opened this book, because here's something that you cannot argue with. You cannot argue with the fact that humans have been cultivating crops. We have the records, we have the history, we have edible varieties of food. You know, I chose rice to show because I think rice is kind of striking in its appearance, right? On the left here, we have human cultivated domesticated rice crops that we normally eat. And on the right, we have wild rice, right? So undomesticated rice. And you can tell that they are actually quite different, right? It's not so much, so A saying make it relatable, got it. It's actually more complicated than that. This choice is not only about relatability, it's also about setting up a very strong base by which you cannot attack, right? We're going to see how he builds up this argument. And if you start with a base that everybody agrees upon, if you share this agreement, there's going to be a part where people can no longer push back. You have to have that common ground in order to draw people deeper and deeper and deeper into your argument, right? The most amazing example for me is the humble wild cabbage. Every part is edible. About half of your vegetable aisle is descended from it. Yeah, exactly. Like, Darwin is amazed by the work of horticulturalists, botanists, etc., people whose job it is to breed into our useful species stuff that we can get out of. And he talks a lot about that in this first chapter. And again, it is a point that you cannot argue. This is just a statement of fact right now. And the more Darwin can convince you that all Darwin is saying is facts, you know, the more he can do that, the more likely you are going to be to accept evolution as an idea. So that's pretty important. How devious? I know. It's a masterclass at science communication. Maze versus maze. Yeah, that makes sense too. There are a couple of different options that you could pick from. Okay, I don't want to read this entire thing, but I'm just going to highlight this part, right? So he then talks about this, and I left this in because I think that Darwin is very rambly in this first chapter. I'm not going to read all of this, but he talks a lot about fertility here, and I'm going to ignore that because I don't think that's very important in this argument. But again, I didn't look at what other scholars of Darwin said this paragraph means. These are my thoughts, and if I get them wrong, that's on me. But just know that I'm not a Darwin scholar. I'm just a molecular biologist reading Origin of Species, right? Make sure to please keep chat in English. Okay. So, I highlight this part. I am strongly inclined to suspect that the most frequent cause of variability may be attributed to the male and female reproductive elements having been affected prior to the act of conception. This is like a crazy insight from the way that Darwin is talking about it, because like, I looked it up. Leeuwenhoek discovered sperm before Darwin, about 200 years before Darwin, and there was a prevailing idea that sperm contained like a tiny little human, which is hilarious. So in terms of ascribing variability among species, Darwin had the idea that it must be something in the reproductive area of a species, right? Which is not a given, right? For us, it's very obvious because these are facts that we've learned since we were very little, literally like birds and bees kind of situation. But for Darwin, it's not as obvious, but he had the hunch that there's something happening within the reproductive tract. He's being very cautious, not ascribing it to any kind of cell type. Again, microscopes were a thing, so you could study cells, but something's going on when animals reproduce, and that is what causes variability, which I think was a very smart, careful way to technically be right without getting it 100% correct. I do wonder how these arguments would work nowadays if presented to someone blind. I would clean up Origin of Species. I think you can cut a lot of this out nowadays. I mean, back then, maybe not, but today you can cut like so much of this. In fact, I would cut this entire part out. He's talking about sterility and taming animals and the fact that if you like, he doesn't talk about pandas, but basically the idea is pandas, when they breed in captivity, they're really bad at it, but in the wild they're pretty good at it. And like I think this is distracting and not very interesting, and also I don't know why he's mentioning it. That's just my limitation at like not understanding the text. Maybe he's got a point. I don't see it though. It's worth pointing out that Darwin is long enough ago that language has noticeably changed since he wrote it. That's true, but this is still very readable. It's just not very understandable. Like I can kind of understand every sentence here. It's just hard to understand the point he's trying to make, because I think Darwin is a rambly kind of writer in this book. And again, this is an abstract. It's not a scientific text. The convention of a scientific text would probably be more concise, although I can't say that for a fact in this day and age. Yeah, he talks a lot about sterility in plants, and I don't know why. And I decided to show you this because I'm not showing you everything in chapter 1. I'm showing you the parts of chapter 1 that I find compelling. So I am skipping a bunch of stuff that is like this whole argument about sterility in plants that I don't understand. So just to be very transparent. Okay, here is a more interesting paragraph though. Okay, and I'm going to highlight this bottom here. Seedlings from the same fruit and the young of the same litter sometimes differ considerably from one another, through both the young and the parents, as Mueller had remarked, have apparently been exposed to exactly the same conditions of life. And this shows how unimportant the direct effects of conditions of life are in comparison with the laws of reproduction and of growth and of inheritance. For had the action of conditions been direct, if any of the young had varied, all would probably have varied in the same manner. To judge how much in the case of any variation we should attribute to the direct action of heat, moisture, light, food, etc., etc. It is most difficult, my impression is, that with animals, such agencies have produced very little direct effect, though apparently more in the case of plants. Under this point of view, Mr. Buckman's recent experiments on plants seem extremely valuable. When all or nearly all of the individuals exposed to a certain condition are affected the same way, the change at first appears to be directly due to such conditions, but in some cases it can be shown to be quite the opposite. Nevertheless, some slight amount of change may, I think, be attributed to the direct action of the conditions of life, as in some cases increased size from amounts of food, color, and from particular kinds of food and from light, and perhaps thickness of fur from climate. So this is basically saying some amount of change is due to environment, that there is an environment aspect of why individuals vary. So this is a very smart thing to acknowledge, right? You feed one pig a little more food, they get a little bigger. That is variability given by the environment, right? And so he acknowledges that some amount of variability has to be in this case, but that doesn't explain why some young of the same litter, say Mark and Scott Kelly, who are identical twins, by the way, so there's still variability of the environment that tells these two apart. But, you know, I put this up because it's kind of a fun example of like Darwin probably didn't have a molecular basis for twins being identical. So to him, the difference between identical twins and non-identical twins would not be perceivable, right? Mark and Scott are identical twins because they're two astronauts. Quite fitting that we're doing a charity fundraiser for Z to relieve wildfire effects in LA. But like looking at these two are from the same litter and they vary. So to Darwin, same parents, same upbringing, they should be, if the environment were the only thing that mattered, if they grew up in the same environment, they should be exactly the same, when in reality, they look a little different. Okay, so there's some element bubbling under the surface that produces variability independent of condition. To us, we know that as genetics, but to Darwin, he didn't read Mendel, as some chatters pointed out. I didn't actually know that Darwin owned Mendel's texts, which is kind of funny. If he had read them, he would have most certainly added to his opus, right? There's something, we can't fill in the blank with DNA, we can't. There's some force, some magic power, something that determines how two individuals with the same litter differ that is independent of the conditions that they were raised in. Okay, I think that is a good start to talking about variability in a way that gets to this idea that there's something going on, right? There's something worth noting. Okay. And so here we're going to explicitly point out some examples, habit, and okay, so this is also one of those things where I think Darwin wasn't completely right, if I'm interpreting this correct. Habit also has a decided influence, as in the period of flowering with plants when transported from one climate to another. In animals, it has a more marked effect. For instance, I find in the domestic duck that the bones of the wing weigh less and the bones of the leg more in proportion to the whole skeleton than do the bones in the wild duck. I presume that this change may be safely attributed to the domestic duck flying much less and walking more than its wild parent. This is a little bit like the way that it's written reads to me like Lamarck, right? Like use a thing more and the next generation will like have an alteration, when cause and effect should be kind of flipped, right? Like we selected for this And I think Darwin understands that. I just think that the way that this sentence is written is kind of Lamarckian. And maybe that's done on purpose because it's a little easier to understand Lamarck than it is to understand selection at this point. So now that I say that out loud, maybe he is purposefully making this sound Lamarckian in order to make the appeal, because this makes more sense than natural selection does right at this very instant. All right. The great and inherited development of udders in cows and goats in countries where they are habitually milked in comparison with the state of those organs in other countries is another instance of the effective use. Again, I think Darwin doesn't even believe this because of what he says later, but it's still like, Lamarck, we know that Lamarck wasn't completely right, not completely wrong either, but not completely right. Not a single domestic animal can be named which has not in some country drooping ears. The view suggested by some authors that the drooping is due to disuse of the muscles of the ear from the animals not being much alarmed by danger seems probable. Now, this is a more, I think, this is a better sentence, right? If there is a lack of selection on the ear to remain upright, then you do get drooping ears. That is a very, plausible mechanism. And so he's setting up these very reasonable statements. These are still pretty reasonable, right? Like, you could at this point push back and go, well, God created the domestic duck. We know that to be wrong, but like it is a pretty good argument that you can't really argue against. Okay. And then he pivots hard. So this is the next paragraph. And this is why, even though a bunch of biology nerds will say, go read The Origin, it's written for casuals, it's quite rambly. So I wanted to show that. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he pivots really hard into speculating as to why things vary. And so we're talking about breeders and stuff here, which I think is a little abrupt from the last paragraph. And while I set it up to make more sense, reading this paragraph after the previous paragraph, it's just all over the place. I picked out a story that makes sense that this follows that, but if you read the book, there's paragraphs and wandering all over the place. Here I want to point out this section though. Hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Long hair and coarse-haired animals are apt to have, as is asserted, long or many horns. Pigeons with feathered feet have skin between their outer toes. Pigeons with short beaks have small feet, and those with long beaks have large feet. Hence, if man goes on selecting and thus augmenting any peculiarity, he will almost certainly unconsciously modify other parts of the structure, owing to the mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. So, chat, are there any biologists, and I know Bobo is one, Bobo, if you could restrain yourself from answering, but are there any biologists, students preferably, who have a thought about the highlighted selection that I have here? Does this seem like a familiar idea that one could be surprised that Darwin understood back in the 1800s? Hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Long hair and coarse-haired animals are apt to have, as is asserted, long or many horns. The mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. Is this familiar to anybody in chat? All right. If you are a biologist and this seems familiar, I would love to hear what you have to think too. Specific proteins showing up in multiple contexts. Sort of. Underlying hormones are affected. Inbreeding? Not quite. Ooh, this is fun. Okay, I thought this was going to be obvious, but it just shows how long I've been teaching biology. He figured out linkage. Yes, Archie. He knew about, I don't think he figured out linkage because I don't think that was his insight, but people at the time knew about linkage. So what is linkage? Right, let me explain linkage. Oh, you missed the, you missed the idea that Darwin here, hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Darwin understood genetic linkage before DNA was even a thing to him. Welcome back from the autoclave. So, the law of correlation of growth. Hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Darwin had an understanding that within the gamete, there is a process called crossing over. So you are not a perfect 50-50 between your mom and your dad. You are 50% your mom and 50% your dad. That is true. but you are 50% mom and 50% dad after they've been scrambled. So during the process of meiosis, your maternal and paternal chromosomes engage in a process called crossing over, where a part of the paternal chromosome will swap with a part of the maternal chromosome. So genes that are very close together will almost always segregate with one another. So something like deaf cats always have blue eyes could indicate that some ear gene is located on the chromosome very closely to eye color genes. And that is crazy, right? So linkage is how classic molecular biologists of like the 50s used to map the chromosome, because you would take a bunch of I think Drosophila flies, I think is what they were using, or peas. I don't remember what model organism they were using back in classic biology days. But they would have a ton of babies, and you would see what traits would segregate with what traits, and the frequency by which they would segregate gave you a distance metric of how far two genes were. So for example, if you had a cat, a set of cats, if all of the deaf cats also have blue eyes, you can make the reasonable conclusion that the deaf gene is very close to the blue eye gene. Very, very close, in the sense where you would never get a separation by random crossing over, because this crossing over happens at random places. And I love that. Mostly flies, thank you, Bobo. My memory is pretty good, isn't it? It's kind of funny that Mendel's writing was just sitting in his book unread, in his book pile unread. I know. Like Darwin had the opportunity to be the greatest scientist of all time by synthesizing Mendel here, at least in my opinion, right? But he fell short because Mendel died in obscurity, which is really sad. But he could have banged out the entirety of molecular bio, or he could have banged out the entire setup for molecular biology in one lifetime, which would have been crazy. Okay. So not only did Darwin have an understanding of crossing over and genetic linkage, even though he had no idea what chromosomes were or what DNA was, people also knew about inheritance rules. So I'm going to read this paragraph as a whole, because if you are a biology student, this is gonna shock you that they knew so much back then. The laws governing inheritance are quite unknown. No one can say why the same peculiarity in different individuals of the same species and in individuals of different species is sometimes inherited and sometimes not so. Why the child often reverts certain characters to his grandfather or grandmother or other much more remote ancestor. Why a peculiarity is often transmitted from one sex to both sexes or to one sex alone, more commonly but not exclusively to the like sex. It is a fact of some little importance to us that peculiarities appearing in the males of our domestic breeds are often transmitted either exclusively or in a much greater degree to males alone. A much more important rule, which I think may be trusted, is that at whatever period of life a peculiarity first appears, it tends to appear in the offspring at a corresponding age, though sometimes earlier. In many cases, this could not be otherwise. Thus, the inherited peculiarities in the horns of cattle could appear only in the offspring when nearly mature. Peculiarities in the silkworm are known to appear at the corresponding caterpillar or cocoon stage. But hereditary diseases and some other facts make me believe that the rule has a wider extension, and that when there is no apparent reason why a peculiarity should appear at any particular age, yet that it does tend to appear in the offspring at the same period at which it first appeared in the parent. God, it's rambly. I believe this rule to be the highest importance in explaining the laws of embryology. These remarks are of course, confined to the first appearance of the peculiarity and not to the primary cause, which may have acted on the ovules or male element in nearly the same manner as in the crossed offspring from a short-horned cow by a long-horned bull. The greater length of horn, though appearing in late in life, is clearly due to the male element. So he's combining a couple of very modern ideas here, which are absolutely fascinating. Yeah, this is absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. I've heard in the context of dog domestication and more recently fox domestication that floppy ears were linked with more docile animals. That's very interesting. Yeah, and the fact that he knew about linkage is nuts. Okay, so as a little exercise for biologists in the chat or biology students, or if you are wanting to participate in trying to remember your biology 101 class, I wanted to sort of walk through, and again, these are just like observations that Darwin had at the time, you know, given the relevant medical literature. His father was, of course, a physician. But we know these as actual rules now. So when the child often reverts in certain characteristics to its grandfather or grandmother, what kind of inheritance is this? Celeste says some form of recessive. Yes, this is recessive. So if you have a trait that acts in the dominant recessive way, then a child can often revert back to their grandfather or grandmother if that gene is recessive. I'm not going to walk through the Punnett squares, but that is an indication that even though they had no idea about DNA, genes, or whatever, they still understood that there are recessive traits. Just amazing, right? Also, just absolutely incredible. Why a peculiarity is often transmitted from one sex to both sexes. So what about this one? This one. One sex to both sexes. This one's a little tricky. One sex to both sex. Sometimes X-linked things also skip to colorblindness, for example. That is true for a different reason, which is interesting. So they realized they were X-linked hereditary diseases. Exactly, Hani. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. So specifically, one sex to both sexes, I would call that X-linked dominant and or recessive. So let me explain myself. If you are XX in terms of the chromosomes that you have, you are going to donate one of your X chromosomes to your child. If you are an XY haver, you will either donate an X or you will donate a Y. So if you are someone that is X-linked or has an if you have an X-linked dominant trait, that XX haver is going to give that dominant trait to their daughters, and the XY haver will get one copy of the dominant version. So you get that expression of the XX haver giving it to all of her children, right? But sometimes that trait can also be recessive, right? Because a mother, an XX haver, might not give enough recessive genes to a daughter, but a male only needs one recessive X in order to have the effect, right? So there's a little bit of trickiness here, and like good scientists, they don't have a molecular mechanism yet, but they can make reasonable models and observations, and I really admire them for that. Over to one sex alone, so I'll just fill this one here. So if it's father to son, it's Y-linked. If it's mother to son, it's X-linked recessive, right? Because mother might not give this to their daughters unless the daughter also got a recessive copy from dad, which is possible, but they didn't have Punnett squares back then, or they weren't aware of Punnett squares back then, and so they couldn't make sense of all of this. But this is how we would explain what Darwin was seeing, right? And father to daughter, X-linked recessive. If daughter gets two recessive genes, of course. Okay. So he's, again, the entire structure is rambly, and so I don't really know why or how he goes to here to this point, but he does something very smart here, Darwin does, after pointing out that there are rules about inheritance. We don't know what those rules are, but clearly there are rules. Sometimes traits skip, we don't know why, but something is governing how traits are being inherited. And back here, down here, he is remarking that, these expressions of these traits, we call them traits and not genes because he didn't know about genes, they happen at different times depending on what traits they are. Like if it were the environment, then that organism would need an environmental cue to have that peculiarity, as he calls it, be expressed. But since there doesn't appear to be environmental cue, that kind of trait has to have been programmed at the stage of reproduction. He calls it acted on the ovules of the male element, right? Which is a very interesting insight. Okay. It's so cool that they discovered X-linked stuff before knowing about X and Y. Yeah, just by keeping very careful track of how traits propagate, they had a fundamental, rudimentary knowledge of linkage and even the sex chromosomes, which is just amazing. Okay. So in order to expand upon this idea that variation of traits could be from the environment only, Darwin prefaces this argument, expects this argument coming. He sees this bullet coming and he responds to it prematurely. Not prematurely, but ahead of time. So he says, if it could be shown that our domestic varieties manifested a strong tendency to reversion, that is, to lose their acquired characteristics while being kept under unchanged conditions and while kept in considerable body, so that free intercrossing might check by blending together any slight deviations of structure. In such case, I grant that we could deduce nothing from domestic varieties in regards to species. But there is not a shadow of evidence in favor of this view to assert that we could not breed our cart and race horses, long and short-horned cattle and poultry of various breeds, and esculent vegetables for almost an infinite number of generations, would be opposed to all experience. I may add that when under the nature of condition of life do change, variations and reversions of character probably do occur, but natural selection, as will hereafter be explained, will determine how far the new characters thus arising shall be preserved. So, basically saying, hold on, let me cook, I can explain this, like, keep an open mind, basically. Okay, he predicts another argument here, which is also very, this one I think makes a lot more sense to me, is a lot easier to understand how he's pushing back on this idea, and this paragraph I will read out loud because this is pretty important, and it's something that I've said a lot on my channel, right? When we look to the hereditary varieties or races of our domestic animals and plants and compare them with species closely allied together, we generally perceive in each domestic race, as already remarked, less uniformity of character than in true species. Domestic races of the same species also often have a somewhat monstrous character. By monstrous, he means like mutant, abnormal, crazy. By which I mean, although differing from each other and from other species of the same genus in several trifling respects, they often differ in an extreme degree in some part, both when compared to one with another, and more especially when compared with all the species in nature to which they are nearest allied. So, domestic breeds look pretty different than their wild cousins. I guess we don't call them cousins quite yet. With each exception, and with that of the perfect fertility of variants when crossed, a subject hereafter to be discussed, and a subject to which I will ignore, domestic races of the same species differ from one another in the same manner, only in most cases in a lesser degree than do closely allied species of the same genus in a state of nature. Just very, very difficult to read. Can you please reiterate the previous argument again, please? This is basically saying that variations due to environment, he's predicting the argument of people saying, oh, varieties just come because of the environment. He's saying that because, or I'm trying to do my best to summarize this because it is kind of complicated to understand. He's basically saying, hold on, I have an explanation that is sort of environment is or not, but just, you know, keep your wits about you. I'm actually not sure what a ring species is, Marlon. But let me finish this paragraph here. Where was I? I think this must be admitted when we find that there are hardly any domestic races, either amongst animals or plants, which have not been ranked by some competent judge as mere varieties and by other competent judges as the descendants of aboriginally distinct species. If any marked distinction existed between domestic races and species, this source of doubt could not so perpetually recur. It has often been stated that domestic races do not differ from each other in characteristics of generic value. I think it can be shown that the statement is hardly correct, but naturalists differ most widely in determining what characteristics are of generic value, all such valuations being at present empirical. Moreover, on the view of the origin of the genera, which I will presently give, we have no right to expect often to meet with generic differences in our domesticated productions. Okay. To summarize this, the important thing to get out of this is just this highlighted part. I think this must be admitted when we find that there are hardly any domestic races, either amongst animals or plants, which have not been ranked by some competent judges as mere varieties, and by other competent judges as the descendants of aboriginally distinct species. He's basically arguing the fact that, you know, drumroll please, biology is a spectrum, right? So are species. The line between a species and a variety is difficult to draw. You could make the argument that species are ones that can have fertile offspring, but there are interesting ideas surrounding that too, and you can't really test to that, you know, level of degree because of confounding variables and stuff. So there's no like hard definition of species. It is, of course, like with many things in biology, a spectrum. What does generic mean in this context relating to genus? I think that's maybe true. I don't know enough about how things were worded at the time, so I chose not to speculate on that particular word. It is an interesting note to make, though, that maybe Darwin is using the word generic in a way that we don't typically use that word today. This feels like trying to read some of the anthropology works I've read. It's quite difficult. I imagine that they're similarly difficult. A ring species is a set of individual populations where those close to one another can successfully interbreed, but at a sufficient distance that no longer works. Yeah, you'd probably quote this part of the book just to be like, yeah, like, you know, there are scientists who say these are specific species and these are not, but they're, you know, competent. You know, he's not making an argument that like there's this school of philosophy that's right and that there is wrong. It's just that like reasonable people disagree depending on their scientific background, and thus like the line between species is actually pretty spectrum like, right? And that's actually a really important sort of idea to incept in people, that the hard category of species, it's going to hurt him if he doesn't state that the definition of a species is fuzzy, right? Because you need to believe that species are fuzzy in order for the whole natural selection thing to work. Okay, so we got some dogs. Darwin didn't actually know about dogs, by the way. He believed that domesticated dogs came from a couple of different ancestors, but actually all domesticated dog species come from wild wolves, and he didn't know that, which was kind of interesting. And so he is trying to make a visual argument here. So he started off by breaking down the definition of a species, saying that reasonable people can kind of like disagree on the definition of what counts as a species. But then when we look at dogs, it's clear to say that like dogs are probably related with one another, and they probably had an ancestor, because the dogs that we raise are of course domesticated, but we don't find their equivalent in the wild. He didn't know about wolves. Who can believe that animals closely resembling the Italian Greyhound, the Bloodhound, the Bulldog, or the Blenheim Spaniel, etc., so unlike all wild Canidae, ever existed freely in this state of nature, right? Again, ignoring wolves. But essentially saying that like dogs, there ain't no way that these dogs just popped in here in the wild, and then we domesticated them, right? Because dogs have an incredible amount of genetic variability in how they present. And so these dogs must have had some kind of stock, right? Like we can identify wild rice and then we get domestic rice. But if you look at dogs, you don't find like wild Scottish Terriers, for example. And so making that curious observation kind of implies that either you could believe that God plopped each and an individual dog species, like dog variety, on Earth, or they have some ancestor, which is a very novel idea here, some kind of ancestor that is no longer around over geologic time. And I think that is very interesting. On the note of domestication by selective breeding, would it be possible to tame more species? I recall there were efforts with foxes at some point. According to Darwin, we could probably do it to anything. Whether or not we could practically do it to anything is a different question, I think. Okay. I'm going to highlight this last paragraph because it's really funny. He says, the offspring from the first cross between two breeds is a tolerably, and sometimes, as I have found with pigeons, because he bred his own pigeons, extremely uniform, and everything seems simple enough, but when those mongrels are crossed with one another for several generations, hardly two of them will be alike, and then the extreme difficulty, or rather utter hopelessness of the task becomes apparent, right? So Darwin is basically saying that like breeding is like really tough. That like this job of breeding dogs is not simple, that the process to create this dog and this dog and this dog had to have been an absolute nightmare, because of something like this. And again, he didn't know about genes. And just to give you an idea of what he's describing, and again, like if he had only read Mendel, this would have made so much sense. So he's saying that two purebreds, let's just call this in the dominant recessive system, double cap A, double cap B, double cap C. These are three different genes that are diploid at each state, and then parent 2 is entirely recessive. If you cross these pure breeds, I'm not going to draw the Punnett square, but every child of these two parents in the F1 generation will be the same. That's what he's saying here, right? When you first cross two pure breeds, it is tolerable because you have a very simple litter down here. Everybody is the same when you breed two purebreds. And then when you cross them again, you get this nightmare expansion of genetic diversity, right? So if we just map it out here, there are two genotypes in the parent, well, two like sets of genotypes all capital or all lowercase. When you cross them after doing your Punnett squares, you get one genotype. And then when you intermate these this litter, you get just a stupid amount of variety, right? Like 64 possible genotypes, if I did my math correctly. And who knows how many phenotypes, right? So these are the genes, and then these are the number of different forms, visual forms that you can test just with your eye. So this cross, this F2, is probably what Darwin was referring to when he's talking about rather utter hopelessness. And as someone who has bred not rats, I bred mice for not a 3-gene system, but a 2-gene system, I can confirm it's pretty freaking difficult to do these crosses. It's not easy at all. Eugenics are selective breedings for humans, but that was really evil. Also, completely missing the point in terms of the spirit of humanity, and that's all we'll say about that, right? Like, it is antithetical to the idea of humanity. So, every discussion of Darwin veers into that territory, and I've already timed out a chatter for being a little too insistent that we take this dumb route that is not very scientific. It's you can find plenty of people who's made it their like YouTube decision to debunk that kind of stuff, but I'm not going to sully my content with mud wrestling, essentially. So we'll just end it there. Okay, so going back to this, who can, we got all these domesticated dogs. We can't find a wild dog that resembles any of them in terms of the breeds of dogs, right? So that kind of is implying that there's maybe an ancestor dog here. Gotta head out. See ya. Thank you for coming. Thank you for hanging out with me. It's been a lot of fun. Okay, so Darwin, his specialty is actually in pigeons. He didn't breed dogs, he bred pigeons, and so he spends a lot of time talking about pigeons here. I was also by A. Thank you for coming. So here we have a paragraph. Altogether, at least a score of pigeons might be chosen, which, if shown to an ornithologist, bird scientist, and he were told that they were wild birds, would certainly, I think, be ranked by him as well-defined species. Moreover, I do not believe that any ornithologist would place the English carrier, the short-faced tumbler, the runt, the barb, the pouter, and the fantail in the same genus, more especially as in each of these breeds several truly inherited subbreeds or species, as he might have called them, could be shown him. So this is basically saying that, like, there are so many different subvarieties of pigeons that no self-respecting scientist would go look at a rock pigeon and be like, oh yeah, these two guys, same bird. Or these two guys, same bird, right? Like, that is unreasonable. So he is laying the foundation here. So variation in a parent's children come from some inheritance law. He's not sure how it works, but he recognizes that mathematically speaking, there is some force that is doing something measurable to how traits are being inherited. The law likely stems from male and female reproductive systems. So again, like synthesizing data from medical records about, generations of inheritance, and sometimes traits are skipped a generation, and that's very reproducible. So there's some rules governing how traits are inherited, and he's trying to set that up for people. So selective breeding can get you breeds of species that look incredibly different, right? And as Marlon is bringing up, broccoli and Brussels sprouts, exactly, same cultivars of the same plant. So things can look very, very different. And ancestral stocks of modern breeds might not be around anymore, sort of implying that this is happening over time, because time is going to be a very, very, very important argument for Darwin, right? Like, this doesn't work unless you open to your mind to change over millions of years, right? So he incepts this idea very early on, this idea of ancestral species, which I think is very smart. And note, he hasn't talked anything about origins or anything. This is just stuff that people are very comfortable with already. And also predicting this argument of, actually, these are just variants, not species, by pointing out the fact that the definition of species was never that solid to begin with, that we should think of species and variants as a little fuzzy. Okay, so if we took a look at the Great Chain model, which we have here, right, just Oh, this should be birds, by the way. Oh no, this is pigeons. There's maybe a class of pigeons, and there are categories of pigeons that are distinct: fantail, carrier, pouter, runt, barb, tumbler. Darwin is trying to build a visual image of, yes, these are all different variants, but they are all similar enough. And we know that we have domesticated this pigeon, right? Like you can take a pigeon and make, start to make some of these breeds. And so he also makes the argument and cites, ornithologists of his day that it is the scientific consensus that these variants come from the rock pigeon, which then became the domestic pigeon, right? So he is citing in this, and this is less satisfying because the average person doesn't have access to this level of insight, but this is the picture that he wants people to build in his mind to get away from this imagery up here. Did Darwin consider anything about microevolution? I don't think he had the resolution on this theory at that time, right? There's no way. He didn't know about molecules. It'd be pretty tough to do even for Darwin. And again, he's doing this move where he's anticipating pushback. He actually quotes some of the interactions he's had with breeders. Ask, as I have asked, a celebrated raiser of Hereford cattle whether his cattle might not have been descended from longhorns, and he will laugh you to scorn. And then he says again, I have never met a pigeon or poultry or duck or rabbit fancier who is not fully convinced that each main breed was descended from a different species. So yes, like the popular conception is this idea of, there are categories of animals, and no matter how closely related they actually are, they're not actually related. But breeders actually, sorry, let me just skip. Breeders of these animals, they do have some kind of acknowledgement that there is this dimension of time. But instead of this tree pattern that we know and love today, it's like this lineal pattern here, where there's some ancient tumbler that became the tumbler, some ancient fantail that became the fantail. But this structure is a lot more similar to this tree structure than the circle, right? Than this. So he slowly, he started with where people were, and he's slowly bringing them over to his side, which I think is really, really elegant. Okay. Micro and macro evolution aren't used in terms of science, more so by creationists, although I won't say more to avoid mudslinging. Oh, I guess I don't know what microevolution even means then. Thank you for maybe bringing up that complexity. Okay, here he hides a little bit of a clapback to this this argument that species are lineal, right? The explanation, I think, is simple. From long continued study, they are strongly impressed with differences between several races, and though they well know that each race varies slightly, for they win their prizes by selecting such slight differences, yet they ignore all general arguments and refuse to sum up their minds slight differences accumulated during many successive generations. So to me, this is like a mic drop moment. Like, you breeders are so dang picky with what you are looking for. Your eyes are so picky. Oh, the beak of this bird is like, half a millimeter longer than the other, so we'll breed this. Like, you freaking breeders are so careful with your assessment of traits that, like, you are failing to see, even though you are so good at recognizing the slight differences between variation, you are not seeing the whole picture. If you just zoom out what you are doing, like if you got out of your own butt for a second and took what you are doing to the extreme, that would make the idea of an ancestral species a lot more palpable, I think, right? Refuses to sum up minds slight differences accumulated during many successive generations, right? You pick apart these breeds, you enhance certain traits because that's your whole job, and you can't like see that if you just pick different traits over many generations that you would eventually get different breeds. Kind of a fun clapback here. Okay. May not those naturalists who, knowing far less of the laws of inheritance that does the breeder, and knowing no more than he does of the intermediate link in the long lines of descent, yet admit many of our domestic races have descended from the same parents, may they not learn a lesson of caution when they deride the idea of a species in a state of nature being lineal descendants of other species? He walks back the clapback a bit, I think, in a smart kind of way, because he's trying to get people on his side, even though this is kind of rude. This is a little rude, but he's in a very British way, maybe being like, okay, but like that doesn't give you a right to make fun of him. He's very, very careful to be nice in this book. Again, not being a neckbeard atheist is serving Darwin quite well. Okay. So again, there's this idea from breeders that you have maybe ancient strains and then they become the modern strains, and then Darwin's trying to get people on his side in this way. Actually, let me reread that for a second. Maybe I read this wrong when I first read it. I have never not fully convinced that each breed was descended from a distinct species. Okay, yeah. So this is like the one-to-one, I think. Okay, cool. Just making sure, because again, it's not an easy read by any means. Okay, so he takes this argument of like, okay, everybody believes that it's one ancestral species to one modern breed, but he kind of makes an appeal. He sucks up to the breeders, right? Like he's expecting breeder clapback, but instead of being like, you're all dumb, you're all stupid, he actually compliments them a lot. We're really correct at selective breeding. He actually sucks up to them so hard, right? So he quotes this story here. The most skillful breeder, Sir John C. Bright, used to say with respect to pigeons that he could produce any given feather in 3 years, but it would take him 6 years to obtain head and beak. In Saxony, the importance of the principle of selection in regard to the merino sheep is so fully recognized that men follow it as a trade. The sheep are placed on a table and are studied like a picture by a connoisseur. He's evoking beauty and art. Like he's sucking up to these breeders. Like, dude, the work that you are doing is so good and so important. Like you're amazing at this. It's just because you're so amazing. If you just change your perspective a little bit, you'll actually realize that you're maybe even more amazing than you think you already are. And I think that's pretty amazing. Okay. Okay, so here he is trying to introduce the dimension of time, right? So I'm going to just read the highlight here. Slow and insensible changes of this kind could never be recognized unless actual measurements or careful drawings of the breeds in question had been made long ago, which might serve for comparison. So he is saying that we know that, through the history of your craft, he's talking to breeders here, we know from your discipline, from the long and storied history of your trade, that there have been an accumulation of traits over a very long time, given the fact that we have records. So you, on your lifespan, you are nitpicking at beak length and everything, and what you are doing is awesome and cool and genius and great, and it's worthwhile doing, and you make a lot of money doing it, and you're great and you're awesome. And your ancestors, the people who begat you, they were really cool and awesome too. And actually they kept notes. And when we look at their notes, we actually see that if you look far back enough, that the animal that you inherited looked very, very different from, some of the greats in your field, essentially. Like really laying it on thick. Like breeding is awesome and you're awesome at it. And we know for a fact that there's some level of change over time, and we have the receipts, essentially. So here is a little bit of a crazy paragraph that I have to include because I think it is my responsibility to not shy away from certain uglier aspects of Darwin's personhood, just because, as a man in the 1800s, there's no way that everything this guy writes is going to be totally like chill with our modern sensibilities. I don't want to make fun of him for it or deride him for it, but I do want to acknowledge that it happens, right? Because I think too often in our modern education, we kind of want to just shy away and ignore the fact that a lot of our favorites are problematic. And it's not wrong. It doesn't make me hate Darwin or anything. It's just that, like, racism is a thing that happens, and colonialism and all that kind of stuff. So just to read this, if there exist savages so barbarous as never to think of the inherited character of the offspring of their domestic animals, yet any one animal particularly useful for them, for any special purpose, would carefully be preserved during famines and other accidents, to which savages are so liable, and such choice animals would thus generally leave more offspring than the inferior ones, so that in this case there would be a kind of unconscious selection going on. We see the value set on animals even by the barbarians of Tierra del Fuego, by killing and devouring their old women. I have no idea if that's true. It's just like an insane thing to write in a book. In times of dearth, as of less value than their dogs. So yeah, kind of a crazy thing to write. I can't confirm like this is a historical account because who knows how accurate that is, and I didn't bother looking into it. But he didn't write this just to be racist. Like, yes, this is like a crazy thing to say, although it's probably not that crazy for the time period. He did this particular rhetorical trick here, which is going to be incredibly important setup for the rest of the origin of species. And so while we kind of cringe at this paragraph today, this is the part that I want to highlight, so that in this case there would be a kind of unconscious selection going on. What Darwin is saying here is that civilizations less civilized than us Brits, even they, with their inferior non-English brains, understood that there's something going on with regards to selection, that if we just keep on breeding the animals that are good, then we're going to keep the animals good. And it doesn't take a genius to understand that when there is a famine going on, you want to preserve your feed and only breed what you think will yield a good product, right? Essentially. So he's not just like dunking on people he views as savages here. He is trying to make the shift into selection being something unconscious, which is going to be very, very important down the line in terms of his argument, right? Because up until now, if you're a breeder, if you're a naturalist, you'd be like, yeah, but like humans, like we're big brain, we're chosen by God, we're very, very, very capable of breeding, and like we're the ones driving these changes. Sure. And then if he were to end the argument there, that's where they would stop thinking, right? But Darwin's trying to bridge this chapter to the next chapter by saying, you don't have to be a high-minded British person who is so smart and good. You can be, quote unquote, a savage and still understand that there is some ability to select. And he's going to use that unconscious selection as a bridge into nature, which is doing this unconsciously, which I think is very, very interesting. I think in this case, it's worth noting that Darwin was also vehemently anti-slavery. Yeah, and he was also relatively pro-woman too. Like, for a guy of his age in that period of time, he was pretty woke. It's just that, like, now you read some of the stuff and you're like, ugh. But back then, for someone of his time, he was pretty pro women and anti-slavery. That's why, like, we don't ignore problematic history. We interpret it in the context and we go, okay, he said some weird things, but they were pretty normal for his time. And overall, he seemed like a pretty good dude. Yeah, so this unconscious selection, pretty weird, but very important for his transition into his following argument. Okay, so then he talks a little bit about horticulture, because this is something that people can more visually appreciate, right? No one would expect to raise a first-rate melting pear from the seed of a wild pear, though he might succeed from a poor seedling growing wild if it had come from a garden stock. The pear, though cultivated in classical times, appears from Pliny's description to have been a fruit of very inferior quality. I have seen great surprise expressed in horticultural works at the wonderful skill of gardeners, shout out to Nep, vtheorem member who is a horticulturalist, in having produced such splendid results from such poor materials. But the art, I cannot doubt, has been simple. Simple doesn't really quite mean like easy, but rather straightforward. As far as the final result is concerned, has been followed almost unconsciously. It has consisted in always cultivating the best known variety, sowing its seeds, although Net might have some clapback with Darwin with regards to whether or not horticulture is actually simple, but from his perspective, it's simple. So we'll just take that, we'll just accept that, even though that might not necessarily be true, although I don't have that personal experience. But the gardeners of the classical period, who cultivated the best pear they could procure, never thought what splendid fruit we should eat, though we owe our excellent fruit in some small degree to their having naturally chosen and preserved the best varieties they could find anywhere. So at least here he's not making a racial argument. He's like, the horticulturists of old, they just didn't know better, right? Like, I don't get from this text at least, any like racial attitude towards Darwin. Just seeing like, oh, back in the day, they just didn't have as much science and stuff, but even they could do selection. And so if they, in the classical period, back in ye old times with terrible pears, create the inception of the pear that we enjoy today, like, if even they could do it, the process has to be in part pretty easy, in idea, we'll say. Okay. And so here he is going to tie this argument together with an argument over time, because this is very important. Anybody who understands evolution knows that this is something that doesn't happen, on a micro scale. This is a macro scale thing. So no man would ever try to make a fantail till he saw a pigeon with a tail developed in some slight degree in an unusual manner, or a powder till he saw a pigeon with a crop of somewhat unusual size, and the more abnormal or unusual any character was when it first appeared, the more likely it would have been to catch his attention. So basically saying that you don't typically just pop these breeds into existence. They are created over a long period of time. They are made through a refinement process, right? Like you don't get a pigeon with amazing tail feathers without an ancestor that had kind of mediocre tail feathers, but like better than the other tail feathers of the same species or same breed. He's making the argument that like this stuff takes time, that you might be breeding on your time scale, but like nature, as he'll call it, like natural selection, can do this over a long period of time. Nor let it be thought that some great deviation of structure would be necessary to catch the fancier's eye. He perceives extremely small differences, and it is in human nature to value any novelty, however slight, under one's possession. Again, sucking up to the breeders. Just tiny, tiny, tiny adjustments. Deciding which male bird to pair with which female bird based on the eye of an expert, the eye of an artur, like being very humble and sucking up to these people whose work he is heavily citing here. Like, if you can be that discerning, why can't nature be that discerning? And nature has more time than you. I think that's beautiful. This is a fun paragraph here that I just threw in because it's neat. Darwin, his attitude on cats. So this is Purkinje, my cat. And then the bottom here. On the other hand, cats from their nocturnal rambling habits cannot be matched. And although so much valued by women and children, we hardly ever see a distant breed kept up. Such breeds as we do sometimes see are almost always imported from some other country, often from islands. So Darwin thinks that cats like Purkinje are for women and children, which I think is very, very funny. I do think Darwin was more of a dog person. Darwin would have maybe, if he had known about genetics and inheritance rules and how complicated cats are with regards to their inheritance patterns, maybe he would have cut them a little slack, right? Because we obviously do have cat breeds, just like we do dog breeds. But the interesting thing, and something that I will cover because we reached our donation goal for my glioblastoma stream, is that the coat color inheritance for cats is horrendously complicated. You also need to keep in mind the wording of the time as well. In many ways, race was interchangeable with nationality, so you'll see them talking about the British, French, or German race. That's true. At the time, the wording is a bit different. It's important to keep in mind that context. Yeah, cat lady. Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess Darwin was right. In terms of the cultural product of cat ladies, we don't really find as a sustainable cultural product a cat man, although that is how I would describe myself. Okay, in sum, and I want to read the final paragraph here, again, just to get an idea of Darwin's voice here. To sum up on the origin of our domestic races of animals and plants, I believe that the conditions of life from their action on the reproductive system are so far of the highest importance as causing variability. I do not believe that variability is an inherent and necessary contingency under all circumstances with all organic beings, as some authors have thought. The effects of variability are modified by various degrees of inheritance and of reversion. Variability is governed by many unknown laws. He's expressing some humility here, more especially by that of the correlation of growth, referring to linkage, which is kind of an interesting insight. Something may be attributed to the direct action of the conditions of life. Something must be attributed to use and disuse. The final result is thus rendered infinitely complex, again evoking this idea of infinite complexity as an appeal to a higher power. In some cases, I do not doubt that the intercrossing of species aboriginally distinct have played an important part of the origin of our domestic productions. When in any doubt, largely aided in the formation of new subbreeds, but the importance of the crossing of varieties has, I believe, been greatly exaggerated, both in regards to animals and to those plants which are propagated by seed. In plants which are temporarily propagated by cuttings, buds, etc., the importance of crossing both of distinct species and of varieties is immense. For the cultivator here quite disregards the extreme variability of both hybrids and mongrels and the frequent sterility of hybrids. So basically saying plant people have it pretty good with regards to crossing over, but the cases of plants are not propagated by seed are of little importance to us, for their endurance is only temporary. Overall, these causes of change, I am convinced that the accumulative action of selection, which he capitalizes, which I think is probably intentional, again, to evoke the fact that this idea is not compatible with your idea of God, whether applied methodically and more quickly or unconsciously and more slowly, but efficiently, is by far the predominant power with capital P. I also interpret this being as another appeal to religiosity, right? This idea that I swear to you, this idea is not incompatible with your beliefs in a supernatural power. And I think these are very careful inclusions because he wants to appeal to the same story, right? This is beautiful too, right? God popping everything into existence. Sure, that can be beautiful to some people, but let me try to seduce you with this idea too, that there is some kind of power. We're calling it selection. Maybe God is acting through this power, but it is a power, and it is, it's got laws like inheritance and correlation and stuff like that, and we're about to get into what I think is going on, and I think it's excellent setup. Would a cat man be called a cat gentleman or a cat lord, since lady has two opposite gender counterparts? That's very fun. I would love to be a cat lord. All right. So, to summarize, variation of parents' children come from some inheritance laws independent of the environment the children were brought up with, because not all individuals of a given litter are exactly the same. So acknowledging, hey, individuals that share a family vary, and it can't be all due to the environment, right? How this is happening, the mechanism is probably having to do something with reproduction. And we have a guess as to why, because sometimes inheritance rules for certain traits are inherited in a sex-like fashion, right? Fathers to daughters, fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, mothers to sons, etc. Selective breeding can get you breeds of species that look incredibly different, right? So making the appeal that human, can do selection. So like re-educating or putting into context this idea of selection as a concept is already very familiar to what people know and understand. Breaking down ahead of time the idea that the line of species and variance is fuzzy, because we are going to make the argument that species can transmute into one another, and it's good to break down that barrier early. The fact that reasonable minds can disagree as to whether or not one thing is a species or if it's a variant instead. We are actually really good at selective breeding and can do so quite quickly. We can amplify the traits of a stock animal to any number of sublineages, right? So you can take a pigeon, you can make it into a fantail. We know that from records of many accomplished breeders over human history. Humanity hasn't always been focused breeders. Artificial selection has likely been happening unconsciously for much of human history, slowly building and refining traits, right? So he's making this argument from the savage thing that he brought up, as well as breeders from the classical period, right? So you took terrible fruit, the pear, and even though they were not very sophisticated back then, they had an idea that you can do this, and it doesn't require design. It just requires a vibe, basically. Good vibe pear, you mate that with good vibe pear, the pear child is going to be pretty good. All right. And then so putting it together, hey, slowly breeding traits over geologic time certainly seems plausible that over human history, or maybe geologic history, as I should say. Oh, I guess here it's not geologic history, but like just planting the seed in people's minds that like humans have been around for a lot of years, right? In human history, man could have made a species, could have, maybe, possibly. It's plausible, right? Like, I mean, you could argue if it did or did not happen, but I don't think you could argue against the fact that it is plausible, we'll say. Fun to watch those arguments play out today between anatomists and geneticists as to where to draw species lines. Exactly, it's an age-old question, right? Like, I ignore it. If the consensus tells me something is a species, I'll be like, cool, dude. I have no dog in this race. So I hope that, chat, you got an appreciation for Darwin's 500 IQ setup here, right? Like, there are so many parts here. As someone who is a science communicator, I'm like, oh man, I I don't think a fraction as much about my words as Darwin did for on the origin of species, considering like his goal was to not get canceled and to really convince people and to tease this idea of natural selection because he thought this was a big deal. My goal is to entertain. And the way that he writes, it's very clear. He's very, 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 very careful. Don't offend religious people. Don't offend breeders. Don't offend my fellow naturalists either. Like, keep everybody's best interests in mind so that we have a huge amount of consensus. And just to give you a tease for, at the end of the series, we'll talk about the fallout. Surprisingly, not many. I think today, if you publish Origin of Species as a new book in some parts of the US, it would be more canceled than the reception to Darwin's book back in his day. Because it turns out all this careful deliberation over the course of years actually really worked. And back then, the religious institutions were a lot more amenable to taking on evolution as part of their ideology as opposed to something opposed to their ideology. Although I believe that the Catholic Church is officially cool with evolution, like on an official level. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, at Darwin's time, there were a lot of sympathetic Catholic priest scholars who expanded upon and defended Darwin's work. And I believe the Catholic Church today is also pretty cool with Darwin as well. The evolutionary geneticist working on butterfly evolution at my former school had hands rated E for everyone. What does that mean? Oh, you mean like they were very, very, very nice to everybody, or they were punching, but they were covering up with gloves so that they didn't offend anybody. That's an interesting way to put it. You're very entertaining. Would love to see you cover the real spicy book, The Descent of Man. I don't want to invite spice on my channel. I think I kept Darwin, my discussion of evolution here pretty sterile is the wrong word, although I'm thinking of the word sterile because Darwin talks about sterility a lot in his book. But like, there are other places to go for spicy coverage. I actually haven't read Descent of Man either, and I don't plan on it, because to me, everything done in my channel is motivated by love, and I love Origin of Species, and I love the work of Darwin, and the Descent of Man I don't love, and so I'm not going to cover it. Yeah, that God could be acting through selection is a good way to convince people, but like people have said, selection can go real bad places when applied to humans. Of course, and it's not something that I will cover on this channel because it's not biology. No serious, like, real biologist that people take seriously in the academy even entertains the idea of human selection. If they do, they are likely outcasts. Weird how that changed exactly. No, they were aggressive. That's very fun. I love the idea of butterfly scientists being aggressive. I'm imagining like Ladian from Pokemon, right? Little boxing gloves. They'd fight anyone. Isn't Darwin's The Descent of Man proof social Darwinism is Darwinism? So let me say this about Darwinism as an idea, right? So the reason why I am covering evolution and not Darwinism is because Darwinism includes this economic principle that I don't think is required for an idea of evolution, right? And so I am not going to talk about Darwinism. I am going to stay in my molecular biology lane of evolution, because when you care about things like disease and viruses and like stuff at that level and genetics and stuff like that, what you actually care about is selection by environment and not competition, but rather what is it called, co-evolution, right? Like the history of our genetic code, we co-evolved with viruses and the like, right? Like things that are built into our genetic code. So I will make no comment about Darwinism as an idea, but just know that you do not need to believe in Darwinism to have a responsible understanding of evolution, right? Because the contribution of his economic theories are, right? That you don't have to have that for molecular biology understanding. the Jesuits had a geneticist position that was offered to our students. It was in the lower section of France. That's awesome, right? Like the new atheist movement kind of ruined this idea that like, oh, we're smarter than people with religion. Religion is delusion. Religion and science have been, buddy buddy for a long period of time. I'm not a historian, but like, like Arabia famously, oh God, what was it called? Again, not a historian, not very worldly at all, in fact, but like the golden age of Islam merged religion and science, and a lot of interesting good science came out of that period. So the idea that these concepts are incompatible is, I think, a pretty modern invention, whereas they have been buddy buddy for a long time. And it's a shame that there are people on both sides who would like to see that connection severed. Would you do one sentence of each of the next chapters if you want? As someone who hasn't read it, it would be nice to know what the rest is about just a little bit. Yeah, sure. We can actually go back to the chapters. Sorry, don't look if you are sensitive to flashing visuals, but I will go here. So from variation under domestication, so this is Darwin's brilliant introduction, my favorite part of the whole book, talking about how man already does this as an excellent setup to variation under nature, and then struggle for existence. So this is going to be an important part of Darwin's argument, and then natural selection. And then I'm going to skip over some of the parts about economics, which I don't really care about. Well, I'll acknowledge them because it's important to it's tough as a science communicator, right? Because you don't want to put weird toxic things into people's brains, but you also don't want to turn a blind eye into things that could be toxic, right? Because that would be irresponsible in a different way. So I'll probably cover it exactly in as much detail as I think is necessary to get an appreciation for this book as a piece of science communication. But essentially, his argument has this general structure. Humans domesticated animals, which was great. Nature also has a lot of variation within nature. So I believe in this chapter, we'll talk about Galapagos and finches and stuff like that. Just like not only can man create variation, but the very nature can create variation, right? Galapagos Islands, you have different bird species. The islands are close enough to have reasonable ancestry with one another, but far enough where those finches could have diverged from each other. So this idea of divergence. And then once we acknowledge that species can vary and that variation can happen under selection by man and under some force in nature, then we talk about struggle for existence, which is talking about selection. So survival of the fittest, not fittest as in the most alpha or the most chad or the most physically fit, but rather fittest for the environment. Are you a square hole that can fit into a square peg, or are you not, right? So don't get that twisted. And then once we talk about the force of selection, like the struggle for existence, then we put into context of this idea of natural selection and how that can lead to the formation of new species. And then we'll talk about the conclusion, which has some very beautiful writing as well, as he waxes poetic about what this all means for humanity. So that's kind of my one sentence summary of the chapters that we will cover. And this middle part is him predicting arguments and acknowledging some imperfections, which I find very tedious. Sure, if you care about the debate between evolution and creationism, you can read those to see what Darwin's original arguments were. I don't think they are necessary for a responsible understanding of natural selection and evolution, so I skip them. Yeah. When I was discussing it with him, I told the priest, I'm not Catholic. He smirked. Well, no, one's perfect. That's awesome. I love a priest with a sense of humor. Well, this is super in-depth. Z, welcome back. Yeah, I mean, I went through paragraph by paragraph some of my favorite selections from this book, and eventually we'll cover the entire book at some point. Not the entire book, but the chapters that I've chosen. Because this is my favorite text, and I would argue the most effective text of science communication there is in existence, right? To convince people who believed that God created every individual instance of a species, and then successfully convincing them that maybe God created a couple of ancestors. Can we go there? Can we adjust our worldview by just that much? And then those ancestors gave rise to a whole expanding universe of diverse animals. that opposition could not have been easy, and it was in fact revolutionary, and I love that a lot. But as you brought up, both the Catholic Church and I don't know how to pronounce that, Anglican Church, and many others besides that hold the official position that evolution happens, God influences it, set the ground rules. So yeah, I think that's fine, right? Like, you know, if we want to argue cosmology, that's not my job. But in terms of origin of species, I have no issue. If you want to believe God made the mother cell or whatever, or God set into motion the chemical processes that began evolution, be my guest, right? That doesn't offend me in any kind of way. But I think that and by the way, if you don't believe in evolution after reading Origin of Species, that's fine too, because Origin of Species is not data, right? If you want to be big brain critical skeptic, then you probably want to see data, in which case he has a follow-up to the Origin of Species that you can read, I guess, if you care about like seeing bones, I guess. And seeing beaks and feathers, and if you're that kind of person, then and you're not convinced by Darwin's logical argument, maybe you'll be convinced by the data. Who knows? But it is fun. It is a fun book, and I enjoyed it a lot. So yeah, now we get to just kind of chat for a bit. I kind of want to chat how you reacted to my coverage of On the Origin of Species, and if you're interested in some of the other chapters, because this is, for me, a very self-indulgent way to revisit my undergraduate work in science rhetoric, which is fun for me because, you know, longtime viewers of the channel know that like I had a fantasy webcomic that I was trying to make back when I was in high school that featured an ape Darwin as like a mentor figure. You know, if you couldn't tell, I'm a huge Darwin nerd. But I want to kind of know, chat, like if you thought this was, or what you got out of it. I think that's a more interesting question rather than did you enjoy it or not. I mean, of course, feel free to tell me if you enjoyed reading Darwin with me. But if you got something out of it, if there was something interesting that you're gonna like roll over in your head a little later, or if there are particular moments of my coverage that resonated as something that you did not expect or you found interesting, I would love to know that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I can continue to just vamp about Darwin in general. But that is all the slides that I have prepared for today. I'll go ahead and just end the presentation on this screen, and I'll go ahead and make one more plug for Z's charity stream for the relief of the LA wildfires. Again, I'll never stop being amazed at the fact that we have like a vtheorem member that has worked at NASA before, like the Jet Propulsion Lab, and has had colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Lab who have been affected personally by these fires. And so, you know, this charity does not go to like them specifically, but rather the general relief of the LA area, you know, in general. But it is part of a personal mission to help those in need. And you know, having the additional motivator of having your colleagues been affected is significant, I would say. I learned what Darwin actually said. Yeah, there's something nice about going back to foundational texts, even though I don't think reading Origin of Species makes anybody into a better biologist, right? Because A, some of the stuff Darwin said is outdated. B, you can interpret any number of these things in all sorts of horrible ways. But it is nice to see a scientific mind firing on all cylinders, right? Because we read this today and there are gaps that we will autocomplete because we know about genes. We know that sperm and egg have genetic material in there that contain blueprint for life, that sperms aren't just tiny humans, right, as people used to believe. And then going back and being like, dang, Darwin knew about linkage. Darwin knew about recessive genes without knowing about genes. And I think that just shows that like this work had to have been a synthesis of so many different ideas, right? Like, not only did he start this trip as like an F-boy college student, but like years and years of careful observation and reading everybody's literature and letters to all the different naturalists that he's in contact to. This was a synthesis of all time, I guess you could say. I would love to see you cover Darwin's finches. Everyone like knows about it, but only as summaries by other sources. So seeing someone cover the original text would be cool. I actually don't remember if Darwin covers the finches exactly. I'm just going off of like what I know about Darwin, right? Because the last time I read Origin of Species from start to finish was like a decade ago. So I don't know if the finches were more of a thing in Origin of Species or if it's in his follow-up work. I don't know when he completed the Galapagos trip, honestly. I like the way that you cover this chapter. Thank you very much. I had a lot of fun. I got to relive some of my humanities proclivities, right? Because, there was a period of time back in undergraduate when I was not going to be a biologist. I was actually going to be a psychologist. And part of human psyche, I think, is in the way we communicate. And so the study of rhetoric, the study of like how people use words was very, very exciting to me. It was weird because I only learned a sanitized basic summary of Darwin. It was nice to see what is outdated and what he actually wrote down. This stream needs a watch over again. Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind words. Yeah. And I love doing this because I love sharing what I love, and I love the Origin of Species. And so thank you all for showing up and giving me the opportunity to indulge in just yapping about my favorite scientist. Galapagos was on the Beagle. Okay. So it was actually on the Beagle. For some reason, I thought it was much later. That trip initially made him much more famous as a geologist. Yeah, Darwin was like, call him like a Renaissance man, kind of like, he just learned everything. His ability to soak up information despite being sick all the goddamn time is very admirable. Like despite being a rich F-boy with like a lot like going for him in terms of privilege, it could not be argued. He worked his tushy off, right? He worked so hard. The volume of work that he has produced is extremely impressive. Yeah, I forgot that like he was looking at rocks and stuff. Like he could not have predicted that the synthesis of these different ideas would in fact cause him to essentially found modern biology. So yeah, very, very fun, very, very fun to geek out about that kind of that idea. Oh gosh. All right. So I just want to kind of yap. His sickness they think might be been what is known as the kissing beetle in South America that carries malaria-like parasite. Oh, I didn't know that. Since he wrote about them biting in his sleep. I didn't know that. Yeah. One of the tragic things about Darwin is that while he did live for quite a long time, he was just so chronically ill and it made him miserable. It's actually really heartbreaking to read some of his letters just complaining. And his his last words to his children were also heartbreaking. I covered them a bit in an earlier stream where I was just yapping about Darwin, but essentially he had wrote to his wife. I think his last words as recorded by his children was that he was very thankful to his wife for taking care of him while he was sick, and that it was almost worth being sick because he got to be nursed by her loving care. And I was like, oh, that's such a sweet sentiment. Also, like the Riz, right? Like, so I'm completing two stories. He wrote that in a letter, I think, to his wife, and on his deathbed, he was actively searching for his wife, I think, in a search of comfort in his like delirium. But like in the sentiment of it was almost worth being sick to be, or it was worth being sick to be nursed by you, is a very sweet, very Riz forward way of saying I love you. Just going to show like if you want to get good at communication, you just have to practice it as much as Darwin did, given the volume of letters that he's written over the years. Yeah, very, very, very sweet sentiment. He's just total softy. Yeah, love talking about Darwin. Also, I forgot to plug my Discord channel, which seemed a little of a harsh transition. No, I'm in streamer mode. I think I can disable that real quick. And if you enjoyed our conversation, I am pretty active in my Discord. you can go ahead and join using the link here. Oh, wife guy Darwin. Yeah, he kind of was a wife guy, wasn't he? He kind of was a wife guy, but I think he is an unproblematic wife guy. So if you haven't joined the Discord, there's the link. Yeah, so for those of you who are still hanging around, I just wanted to plug that I am working desperately on getting a video on the flu out. So just to make my own plug before I sign off and plug the other creators who are in this project, I am working on a video about influenza, which has been very, very, very difficult. It's really, really hard because the flu is a very complicated virus to understand. So I am asking for your well wishes as I have a planning document that is longer than some scripts that I have written. That's how complicated this video is. And I hope that you will watch it when it comes out. Okay. Chagas disease. Oh, I've heard of that. Oh, I just noticed the DNA of your VTuber avatar wiggles when you talk. Yeah, that's thanks to Toxo, who made pretty much everything that my channel, pretty much all the original content that my channel has made is in part due to Toxo having given it visual form. Flu video, nice, looking forward to it. Well wishes, thank you very much. I am getting a bit tired from yapping, and so I will go ahead and once again redirect you to some of the other exciting events that are happening today. If I yap for like another half hour, I might be able to just raid into Myelin, which would be very, very exciting, which I might actually choose to do. Why not, right? So let me see. Yes, I will decide to raid into Myelin. I'm going to ask Myelin for a link to their live stream. Link to your live stream, please. I'm gonna raid into you, Lamau. Okay, so what can I talk about for half an hour? I'm pretty good at yapping. Is there anything that chat wants to talk about, especially if there are students who are just starting a semester at college? Sue, drink some water. Yeah, I will. I will take some free like office hours right now for the next half hour, and then we will raid into Myelin, who is going to be talking about emotional resilience to wildfires, which is an extremely apt paper to cover. I think that is, I couldn't think of a wildfire theme in a week, but Myelin did, and that's awesome. And I think it'd be interesting to learn from a psychologist some of the underpinnings of how psychology research is done, and in a very relevant situation in terms of the response to wildfires. So I can't wait to get into that. Thank you. Really enjoyed the video. As a huge Darwin nerd myself, I really enjoyed getting another perspective on the book. That's so interesting, Stephen. In what way are you a Darwin nerd? I'm not like gatekeeping you. I'm just interested because the way that I would describe myself as a Darwin nerd is that I'm coming from a molecular biology perspective and not an evolutionary perspective. Like, I use evolution in my practice of biology in a very pointed way, and so I have a very pointed perspective on Darwin, which might not align with an actual like Darwin historian, which is why I'm curious as to how you arrived into being a Darwin nerd. Can you make a video about misconceptions about molecular biology? That is interesting. That's 4 p.m. PST, by the way. Oh, sorry. That's 3.5 hours. Oh, yeah, then I'm not going to be able to raid into Myelin. That's true. I forget that these are in PST times and not EST. Thank you, Penboo, for the correction. Thank you. Go check out Penboo's Tetris stream, where he is going to donate every time he loses Tetris. So if any of you are very good at Tetris, you can contribute to the wildfire without spending a dime, as long as you can beat Penboo in a one-on-one. You had me scared there. Sorry, Myelin. I got the timing wrong. In any case, I'll yap a bit longer anyway. I want to talk about misconceptions about molecular biology. What would even be misconceptions that you would be able to think of? None really come at the top of my head, really. My background isn't in biology, but I am the kind of person who studies everything that passes in front of me. Darwin is just kind of one of those giant figures who comes up a lot, so I made a point to. That's really interesting, and I'm wondering how you would feel about an Oppenheimer movie, but about Darwin. I think that would go pretty hard. Although, I think Oppenheimer would have to be very serious, and I think Darwin can be a comedy, a tragic comedy. Just because Darwin's kind of a funny guy. Darwin took a selfie with, well, not a selfie, but he had a portrait taken because photography was just starting to pop off, and his reaction to how he looks in his photo is a very relatable human reaction, being like, damn, I'm like ugly. I love it. Yeah, if you have an idea for misconceptions, I would not be opposed to doing it as a series of shorts, just because my long form videos are reserved exclusively for these long, passionate videos about biology stories rather than like misconceptions. Because here's the thing about that content. I was just watching one about a medical scientist debunking some misinfo stuff on Wired, I think. And so, like, my main passion is in these long videos, and that's always going to get my attention. And while like top 10 misconceptions about mold bio, I probably would go pretty hard algorithm wise. I don't have the we'll call it investment because it's not the kind of content I want to make, but as a short, I think it would work quite well, and I would be able to do that just because, again, like, the list of long videos is growing and I am slower than how fast the list is growing. We'll just put it that way. How about that cells are compared to machines? I think the analogy is fine as long as you don't take it to extremes, because there are tech bros who are like, oh, all we have to do is put in the DNA and we can do anything, which is not entirely correct. I love dunking on tech bros who think they can biology because they can program. Darwin did have a biographic film called Creation. Oh, that'd be interesting to check out, I think. Just reading about his daughter in particular makes your heart reach out for the man 200 years after the fact. Yeah, his letters are so brutal. I think after the final Darwin stream, like after the conclusions, I will cover the letters, because it really, Darwin's just a guy. He's like a really obsessive, really smart guy, but he's just like a guy, a very loving individual, a very passionate individual, and it's nice that we have so many of his letters preserved. I guess the misconception is that molecular biologists look through light/lens microscopes while electron microscopes are more common, right? That's interesting. So I can say that that is not true, because molecular biology is so broad. So in terms of the microscopes, you have regular light microscopes that I use. Actually, that's the most common form of microscope that I personally use in my practice, because mammalian cells are big enough to see with your regular light microscope. And so when I'm checking for the health of my neurons, 60x mag, that's all you need. That's, you don't need to go too crazy. You don't need a very expensive microscope to look at neurons, which is very fun. And going down from a regular bright field microscope, you have like fluorescence microscopes, which still use light, but like epifluorescence is not that highly powered, but uses a different form of light than visible light. And then you get down to confocal microscopy, which can take slices, which still uses light and is very common. I would wager a guess that confocal microscopy, fluorescence confocal microscopy, is probably more common than EM. But I think the soul of the question is good, because the imagery of a scientist looking into a benchtop microscope, that's the actual thing that you get when you look up scientist on Adobe stock, right? Like a lot of stock photos will have a benchtop microscope, when in reality, it's not that that's not a common microscope. It's just that there are so many more, electron microscopes being one of them. So I think it's a good start for a short idea about expanding people's ideas of microscopes, because I love looking at stock photos of scientists. It's like my hobby of just, if I have a repository of scientist photos, it's just so funny. That would be a fun stream idea one day, is to rank science stock photos for accuracy in a tier list or something. It'd be a lot of fun. Take a drink of water here. By the way, I will probably hang out in Myelin stream in some form or another, because I will be working on this influenza script, which is like from hell. Yeah, I don't know, misconceptions in biology. So I'll actually write these down, because, I don't want to like talk about these ideas in chat and then do you the disservice of immediately forgetting all of them. I have this running gag with Toxo that like any idea that I have in the shower, it like doesn't make it out of the shower, and I call it like the chain of memories. Like the shower is like the plot of Chain of Memories from Kingdom Hearts. It's sapping my memories. I'll have a really good idea, and the second I step out of the shower, it's gone. So the last slide here, I am going to have misconception ideas. Misconception ideas. So let me misconception ideas, and then one of these can be microscopes. That's not a bad idea, I think. Let me apologize to Myelin for shocking them. My bad. Remember high school bio and having to prep a dye slide on onion skin so we could see the cell division. Yeah, exactly. Good times. Getting to use a microscope for the first time in high school is very, very exhilarating. Even if I thought that, you know, it is just my personal taste that plant cells are not that interesting to look at because my taste is in mammalian cells. It was still a fun experience, and it is an important experience for high schoolers to have because everybody gets into science for a different reason, right? Like, I don't have that much pleasure working in science, like doing the science thing. I don't really get that much pleasure out. But I love talking about science, so that is why I have chosen to do what I do, right? Whereas other professional scientists might actually find, you know, the process of looking at stuff under a microscope, collecting data, analyzing the data, you know, there are scientists out there who enjoy that stuff and therefore are more suited for that job than I would be. All right. So microscopes, you know, because like there's old ground of like, you know, vaccines, mercury, you know, stuff that has been done 1,000 different times by other people that, you know, I wouldn't really have my own unique take on, which I kind of want to stray away from. Again, I think algorithm wise, that would be pretty good, but in terms of enjoying the process of video content creation, I would think a little more deeply about what I uniquely could bring to the table that no other biologist could. We never did that. We looked at protozoans only, couldn't see plant cells specifically, sadly. If I ever like strike gold, like if the algorithm gods ever decides to make another video pop off and I start getting affiliate money and sponsorships, like big sponsorships and stuff, I would love to buy a benchtop microscope and have like a mini lab in whatever situation I'm in. But as of right now, right, tiny 1-bedroom apartment, no room for a microscope setup, or a dedicated biology office. I would love to do that live on stream, and I know some VTubers who actually do that, right? Famously, Amelia Watson used to do that kind of stuff. I think Shiori Novella has done some of that stuff. Entomolo Moth, which is another VTuber in the indie space, who is an insect VTuber, has done similar things, like a hand cam microscope stream inspecting insects, which has been very fun. And I would love to do that if I ever made big bucks. If I could afford somehow like an office setup where I could have mammalian cells on stream, that would be a lot of fun. I'm currently in the first year of master's program in molecular biology. I think it's good, but we don't have much practical work. Could you please give me advice on how to fill this gap? It depends on what university you're at. If you're at an R1, you should not have that much trouble finding a lab to do work in. So if you could expand on your exact situation, I would love to offer my 2 cents. Plant cells are big, stupid tough, and easy to deal with, so perfect for a bunch of high schoolers more interested in screwing around. Yeah, that is true. Mammalian cells are, man, they are tough, right? Like, I had to learn how to do it almost on my own because the graduate student who was supposed to mentor me and the postdoc that was supposed to mentor me, they both left the lab at the same time, and then I was the only member of the lab for a long period of time. It was really tough to pick up a lot of these skills when dealing with mammalian cells alone because, you know, for those of you who don't know, bacteria, super hardy, They'll kick your butt any day of the week. Mammalian cells, especially neurons, are fragile, special little snowflakes. Mammalian cells that are immortalized, like HeLa cells, and cells that have differentiation potential, like Hex cells, they are pretty hardy. Like even high schoolers, I think, could do it. Although because you need to sign very specific legal documents in order to work with mammalian cells that are derived from humans, high schoolers typically don't get that experience because the paperwork is a headache. But those are pretty hardy, and undergraduates can bash on them all day and they'll still survive. Neurons that are what's called post-mitotic, they're done dividing. You have to beg them. You have to beg them to grow. It takes a very careful, steady, skilled hand to get them to grow reliably. And I think it took me 2 years to get confident with my technique. It's pretty nuts. In terms of master students, because PhD students are often guaranteed a research experience, it can be kind of hard for a master student to get into a lab. So I would recommend maybe asking for collaboration across different universities if there are affiliated professors. If your university doesn't have an open lab that you could join, maybe a partner university does. And I would recommend that you should definitely, when you reach out, make it very clear that you read the work of whoever you're asking to work with. Don't just go, "Hi, I'm a master's student looking for a place to work. Can you let me in?" No, read everything. Not everything, but go to the faculty page and read like 3 of their papers and communicate exactly why their research fascinates you. And that will make you a lot more of an appealing candidate than someone who just shows up and goes, "Hey, let me into your lab." Show that you actually have some investment. That'd be an interesting video for you to do on the history of HeLa cells. Read a book on Henrietta Lacks some time ago. That would be more appropriate for Neutrophil, my second channel, whose link you can find in the video description, because that strays away from molecular biology and more into stuff that is adjacent to molecular biology. So I won't say no, but I'll say for Neutrophil maybe, because, you know, as a socially responsible scientist, we should not, again, turn a blind eye to stories of exploitation that is built into the history of our science. Just because we ignore it doesn't mean it doesn't happen or it isn't there, but we can learn from stories like that. So I'm actually not super familiar with Henrietta Lacks' story, like every detail, but from what I understand, it is quite tragic in certain regards. You can correct me if I'm getting it kind of wrong. Okay. I am reaching the end of how long my voice can last. I did 12 hours last week, which was crazy. Which, by the way, I'm still so grateful for all of you who have showed up to that last fundraiser that we did for glioblastoma. I couldn't sleep because I was basking in the afterglow of having so much fun. And I'll never not be amazed by what we can cobble together as a small community. But yeah, I'm not from the USA, so I was wondering if you have any advice about key concepts or knowledge I should have before starting a PhD. Oh, in the US, you can just start a PhD. I would say that my #1 piece of advice for any PhD student starting off is not about knowledge, right? You'll learn everything you need to learn in graduate school. You'll take classes, and you will have your... It will be challenging. Like, grad student classes are not easy. You are going from learning from a textbook to learning from papers, and that shift is very intimidating, and the language of papers is very hard. And if you are reading in the universal language of English with regards to what science is published in, it can be even more challenging. So be patient with yourself with that regard, and kind to yourself, obviously. If English is not your first language. I mean, just because you're not from the USA doesn't mean you don't speak English, but I was just being broad with that assumption, right? The #1 advice I have for anyone starting grad school is join a lab where you fit the work environment and the culture. So say, for example, all I want to do is study cancer, but the only professor that has a cancer lab in the department is known to be very hands-off, and I think I need some hands-on mentorship. For you, I would say it is better to choose something related to cancer with a professor who works better with you, because you need to finish. I would say, unless you know you're a superstar, go with a lab that has more support, even if it's not doing the thing that you want to do in the long term. And just because you don't do cancer doesn't mean that you'll never do cancer, right? Take the long view of this, right? Think over the course of your career, not over the course of graduate school. If there's not a cancer research opportunity, maybe there's a longevity opportunity, right? Maybe there's a lab that studies C. elegans and how certain genes contribute to how long a worm can live. That has a very natural overlap with cancer, right? You will pick up a lot of the same skills you need for cancer research while studying longevity. So be tactical about the topic and humble about what you need from a work environment. Because I took a lab that was very small and would have worked very well for a superstar, and I didn't even think I was a superstar. I was just so enamored by the research subject that I ignored my own internal warning signs that I would not do well in a small lab. I need that more robust support, but I ignored that feeling in favor of chasing my passion, which I don't regret, by the way. It's just that if I wanted to finish my PhD, I should have picked a lab with more support. So I hope that advice can go pretty far for you. No Tragic sums it up as well as I think with any case involving cervical cancer in the 1950s. That's a good bridge into talking about my plan for next year's 12-hour charity stream. I will be planning to do cancers of like cancers in women, basically, because women have a unique place in the history of biology. So I have decided to do cancers in women, and part of those cancers, one of those cancers are, or some of those cancers are cancers of the reproductive tract, including cervical cancers. Maybe the misconception about the amount of molecules in cells versus molecule outside of the cells in the body. I thought things were basically all in cells, but there's a lot of molecules, other molecules too. Oh, good. Yeah. That would actually be pretty cool. Like ECM. Or what do you imagine is the life of a cell? So ECM stands for extracellular matrix, and it's often a dimension of biology that I myself ignore because I'm not an ECM person, but it is always there and it always has to be considered. So I think that's interesting. All right. Sorry, there's just so many more things in chat. I'd be more interested in learning about the use of HeLa cells in the lab, which I think is more molecular bio than her life story, which is more covered in detail elsewhere. I also hear HeLa cells can also cause problems in the lab, being somewhat hard to eliminate. I have heard of HeLa contamination, but I have not personally been affected by it as far as I understand. What is true is that HeLa cells are used all the time in molecular biology when you just need a human-like cell. When you don't care about the specifics and you just need a mammal cell that is maybe human-like, because HeLa cells have been, they're not quite, they've been modified a little bit. They're not quite the same as a normal human cell, because if you just take normal human cells, there's going to be a finite number of times that they can divide. And so HeLa cells they have a cancer-like quality to them. And so when you just need something, a very basic research question is like, does this small molecule drug inhibitor kill cells? Like, is it toxic? Before you introduce it to an animal and risk an animal's life for no good reason, you might first choose to test it in something like a HeLa cell. So it is the backbone of a lot of cell-based research, because when you just need some mammal cell, it's a pretty good candidate, although it's got some nuances to them that are something to consider. Actually, in our current setup, in my professional job, we are actually finding that HeLa cells are maybe not very good for our specific project, because there are some quirks to HeLa cells that I don't want to dox myself and confirm to my students who I am, if there are any of my students in chat, because I have not made that public. But I don't want them to be like, oh, interesting, that, right? I want to maintain that plausible deniability. But there are some quirks about how HeLa cells are that make them not appropriate for every application that you might want under the sun, which is pretty cool. HeLa or CHO. Yeah, CHO, so that's Chinese hamster ovary cells. Those are another cell line that you could just say, I just need some cell that is mammalian MEF cells. So that is mammalian embryonic fiber mouse embryonic fibroblast. Yeah, sorry, mouse embryonic fibroblast. Another happily reproducing cell line that you can use when you just need a cell to test and you don't care about specifics. All right, good chat, everybody. Let me go ahead and one more time, just to end on, again, please look away if you don't like the shifting, but I just want to scroll all the way back up to plugging the other content creators who are contributing to this donation goal. Right, so Z put out a call for VTubers to join for raising funds for this LA Wildfire Relief. I have had the honor of talking to you all first, and already I am just one out of the 12, and we have already raised $82 out of Z's initial goal of 314, which is of course very cute, very fun goal to reach. Of course, she also has these insane stretch goals that I think are amazing. It'd be very cool to say that we put a VTuber in space, as you see right here. Z is, she is a very powerful person. Oh, and we got a donation from Anonymous. I did not know that was going to come with a sound alarm. Thank you, some Joe, for $4. Or was that Anonymous? I can't tell. The thing is, like, I can't tell with the thinking overlay where that came from. I think that was a $10 donation from some Joe. But yeah, thank you so much for the donation. Wait, it's Pi? Yeah, it's Pi. And then 2 Pi, which is very, very, very fun. Okay. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for donating for the Wildfire Relief. Please make sure that you screen grab this schedule page. I'll also post it as a community post shortly after the stream ends. These are in PST times. I will be hanging out in Myelin stream today, probably scripting my influenza video, which I hope to get out some point in February or early March. So just want to let you know what's happening there. Also, all these amazing creators, a lot of them I have mentioned on stream before. Phaedra Sarah is participating as well. Penbu, again, that amazing idea for I will donate every time if I lose in Tetris. If you don't have money, but you are really good at Tetris, you can squeeze the money out of Penbu, which I think would be really fun. Psydere's done with her thesis, so Psydere's having a huge comeback stream at 8 a.m. PST, which I am so jealous I'm not going to be able to make, but please go in my stead and please let her know that you are coming from my audience, which would be super fun. Nep is also contributing, talking about the role of horticulture in wildfire management, which is so directly related, obviously, to what the heck is happening over in California. Although that's not on the schedule yet. It is happening tomorrow, though, at some point, and I will post something in the community tab about when that will happen, so you know when that happens. And yeah, all these other amazing content creators deserve your attention too, and we are all banding together again for the combined purpose of providing relief for these people who have been uprooted by these fires. All right, strong start. I will hopefully see you in Myelin stream later today. Goodbye, y'all. Goodbye.